get us started. Yeah. All right, before we start talking about chapters 3 to 17 of part 2 of Don Quixote, any business, anything not directly related to these chapters that anybody wants to bring up at this time? Okay. Yes, Larry?
Why do we think, why does Cervantes have something against university students?
That's a good question. What do you think, Larry?
I don't know. He portrays them in a, in a less than favorable light.
Huh.
I don't know. It's like a social commentary on formal education.
So you're thinking of Sanson Carrasco at least. Who else? So there's the son of Don Diego de Miranda, who, at least if you ask Quixote, he's doing all right. Who else?
The madman in the prison,
right? He's
who seeks his freedom.
I mean, I kind of get the sense, I don't know, I don't have a view about this, but that saying someone went to the University of Salamanca is like saying a Harvard grad is kind of like a stock egghead character or something like that.
Right.
I don't know if Cervantes has it in for people like that or what. But
did Cervantes, did he have a formal education?
I think he was educated. What I've read is that he was tutored by learned men, I think, who might have been associated with the church. There were two names mentioned in the brief biographical stuff that I've read, but I don't think he went to a university.
I just wonder if his portrayal of university students isn't a reflection of some deeper feeling that he might have had as a result of his perhaps erratic education.
Yeah,
but it's interesting, wherever university student is mentioned or appears in the novel, it's generally not in a favorable light.
Interesting. Anyone have interpretations of this? Karen?
Well, it's not an interpretation, but I'm not sure it's university as we think of university, because I think it was more like what we would call high school and university. I think universities were the only sources. I mean, I believe from what I read at the time, only source of secondary education outside tutoring. So I'm not sure it's like going to college, that's all.
I can't say I know a huge amount about Spanish universities during this period. I know a little bit about universities in the mid 18th century from teaching Adam Smith, but any other views about this before we move on, or any other business unrelated to chapters 3 to 17 that we should take on? Okay, then let's dive into the questions.
Start the recording, or you did?
I did.
Okay.
I've got your reminder recorded, Charles. Not to worry. So I have a kind of grab bag of questions about this discussion in chapter 3 between Sanson Carrasco, Don Quixote, and Sancho. It's their discussion of the first part of Don Quixote, which has become famous within the world of the novel at this point. Sanson Carrasco is filling in Quixote and Panza about all the details of what's included and how it's been received and so forth. Rather than read all these points of this discussion that I've asked us to interpret, I mean, I guess I can take us to individual points if nobody has thoughts, but are there any particular things listed in 1A through E that you'd like to discuss? Cindy, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Yes.
What they're talking about is not what we just read, right? Or is it what Sid, I mean, the author of that was Sid, C-I-D-E. What we just read was based on Cid, right? I just
Um,
I want to make sure I know what
That's a
they're
good
talking
question.
about.
So I think it must be what we just read, because what Side Hamete Benengeli, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that in the way that it should be, but wrote was written in Arabic. And what we read, although it's in English while we're reading, so it's a translation of a translation, what's reached the audience that Sanson Carrasco is talking about is in Spanish. So he must be referring to the translation that has been translating into English for us.
Okay.
But maybe it never occurred to me that it was otherwise. So maybe there's another interpretation of this that's out there. Does anyone have it?
I was just confused because I thought what we read was an author writing using Cid, but not translating Cid, but using Cid. And this seems to be saying that what they're reading was written by Cid, though it sure sounds like what we just read. So
Yeah.
it may not make the slightest bit of difference, but that
So
was just my
my
confusion.
sense is that what we read was a translation along with commentary. So mostly translation and then some commentary. And I'm guessing that that's what Sanson Carrasco is referring to here. But if there are other readings of this, I'd be curious to hear them, because it never occurred to me this might be an interpretive crux, something that actually needs to be interpreted.
Was the
Okay.
only confused person.
I'm sure that can't be true, but all right. This novel is confusing. So what do you all think? Okay, I've asked about all these, how we should interpret all these individual aspects of the conversation. They're laid out in 1A through 1E. Among 1A to 1E, are there any particular items that interest you, that you'd like to discuss? Larry, and then Steve.
How do we know that Sidi Hamed Benengeli is a liar?
How do we know that he's a liar?
Yeah,
Is he a liar? Depends on.
and a liar, and that Moors can't be trusted, or there a lot of inaccuracy arises, in his account of Don Quixote. How do we? Is there any evidence in the text to indicate that we've been misled?
So I take it you're referring to 1A. Quixote says
Right.
He remembers that the author of that history was a Moor, and you can't expect a word of truth from any Moors, since the whole lot of them are deceivers, liars, and storytellers. I take it, Larry, you're asking the question, how do we know that Quixote is right, or is he right? Is there independent
Or
evidence?
whether or not he's right, and if he's not right, what would be his motivation, or what would Cervantes' motivation be for depicting the teller of this tale to present a misleading story?
Okay, good questions. So one vote for 1A and twist on it. Steve, and then April.
Yeah, I took the tone of each of these almost as a little bit of regaining control of the narrative in a funny sense, which is to assert the, talking through both the manner in which it's reported and explaining, if not explaining away, explaining the errors that presumably readers of the first book would have seen. And so to me, it's a little bit of I don't think it's a question so much of whether Cide's book is somehow more or less accurate. I think that in the same way that Cervantes has been playing throughout with the notion of these true histories, which obviously are not true histories, are recaptured from an unreliable Moor, who may or may not be an unreliable Moor. But I think that's simply the notion of getting us back into, I'll say back into the Hall of Mirrors, in the same sense that, you know, we have the kind of a scale of doubting the narrator to a character who may or may not be mad. I think this is a simply stage setting for what's to come.
So the claim made by Quixote and some others that Cide Hamete Benengeli, like all Moors, is a liar and unreliable is just one more source of call it epistemic chaos. We don't know where to find sound footing, and whether Quixote is right about that, about Benengeli, or about all Moors. It doesn't matter, because it serves to just increase the epistemic chaos, our inability to tell what's reliable from what's unreliable. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, this is one where, again, and this whole second book is coming to light after X number of years, and an in-between book that was written by someone else, which he's trying to some degree, cast into doubt. But I think it's just part of the whimsy of the way the story is being told, to have this multiple layers of unreliability built into what, when you get into reading the stories, feels like a true story in some sense. So I don't take it as more or less than that.
Okay, thanks. April, and then Cindy.
I would agree with what Steve just said about it. It places you in between somehow, where you're not sure if you should trust this or not trust this. And for me, when I read that about the lying Moor, it reminded me of the Odyssey, where Odysseus is known to be, you know, Cretans are liars and anybody from Crete can't be trusted. So I felt like that kind of threaded the needle for all these, you know, Homeric Odysseys and big fictional pieces of work, that this is satirized, or that this is there's some sort of basis with that kind of old tradition.
That in a long and winding tale, you throw in a character who's unreliable and have that character be the basis for some long tale within the larger tale that just kind of scrambles all our intuitions about what we can trust generally. Is that the right way to capture it, April?
Yes, and also we have a hero, and the hero does heroic things, and I just think it gives it some more reliability in that sense, because it's a story we know, it's a story that's familiar.
Well, that's paradoxical. So including characters who are unreliable, who spin a good yarn within a story makes it more reliable, because this is a kind of trope of long, winding, epic style stories. So it's like reliability through unreliability. We fall into a tradition where including unreliability within it makes the tradition more familiar to us and legible. That's an interesting thought. Cindy, go ahead, and then Steve.
So Don Quixote makes that comment, as you noted, the translator does also. However, as Carrasco is describing what's in the book, at no point, unless I missed it, do Don Quixote or Sancho say, well, that didn't happen. They kind of say, did he cover this? And then there's the thing about maybe he didn't have to put in so many beatings, but what he's saying about what's in the story, assuming, of course, the person writing the second part isn't lying, the people who the story was written about may say that Moors lie, but they're not saying, so far anyway, unless I missed it, that what was in the book was a lie.
Right.
So that makes me think that it's just a thing about, you know, in 76, they put it more, Arabs all lie because they aren't Christians. Mm-hmm. And then here's they all lie. As a group, they lie. Their reputation is they lie. But so far, it isn't like if you read an article about yourself from a newspaper or something, you go, that didn't happen, right? These people did not seem to be saying that.
Right.
Makes me think that even if they as a group have a reputation for lying, so far we haven't found an example of them lying?
I think that's important. So this is not a claim that Cide Hamete Benengeli has included demonstrable lies that have been identified by either the narrator or Don Quixote. There's just a kind of blanket prejudice that all Moors or Arabs are liars and not to be trusted, which, you know, coming from a narrator who's declared at the outset of the book, I'm going to include a whole bunch of lies in here. And Quixote, who is not exactly reliable, even if he, well, I mean, I think he probably is a liar in some respects. He says things that he knows to be false because they fit with his narrative. I mean, maybe that is an indication that we should take this just blanket charge that people who belong to a certain identity group or religion or ethnicity are all liars with a kind of grain of salt. This itself is a blanket charge that's not very well substantiated. So to be handled with care. Okay, Steve, and then Mark.
I also think he's reintroducing a theme from the first book about what's the nature of truth.
Mhm.
There's factual truth, and then there's the truth, you know, beyond the factual truth in terms of what we're seeing and learning about the individuals. Even if the facts aren't exactly right and the names get changed and the places aren't exactly right, and maybe some of the stuff didn't even happen, the underlying truth that the book is talking about, the nature of human beings, the nature of aspiration, belief, faith, and stuff like that, can be true in a different sense, even though the facts themselves may be everything from in dispute to outright lies to undefinable in terms of where on that spectrum it is.
So that's an interesting thought, and I actually think it pertains pretty directly to this passage that I quoted in 1C. So I want to ask you what you think about this, Steve. Is this the kind of truth that you have in mind, or are there more species of truth? So, you know, oftentimes when we say we think about truth just without any point of reference to a particular kind of truth, we think about the matchup between claims and the world. If the claims match up with facts about the world, then they're true, and if they don't, they're false, and that's usually what we mean by truth. But of course, that's not the only way we use the word, and certainly not the only valence that the word has. Here in 1C on page 504, Quixote says that the history could have just as well have kept quiet about all the beatings he received because, quote, there is no need to narrate actions that do not alter or undermine the truth of the history if they are going to result in discrediting the hero. So the story has a kind of truth that the inclusion of more facts couldn't alter or wouldn't affect, wouldn't alter or undermine, even if they wouldn't add to that truth. It's as if they're irrelevant to this other kind of truth. Is that the kind of truth you have in mind, or is this a kind of cousin?
I'll call that a slight angle away from it. I think that, I mean, April's drawing the analogy back to Odysseus, and you know that he's known as a scoundrel and a liar and a trickster. And there's even some debate as whether he says a true word in the entire story. And yet there are some deep emotional truths that permeate the Odyssey and that we walk away with and we think about. That's the kind of thing that I was thinking about. This is the notion that you make something more true by leaving out half the story, maybe, but I think that's almost a little bit, I mean, the answer, I think that that's as much an example of looking at the tales of chivalry to find truth. You know, again, this is in fact, it's almost an argument in reverse, which is presenting a wholly pure narrative where you leave out any of the bad parts that might detract from the heroism, arguably gets us further away from the truth, and that we've simplified the story to a level that we begin to doubt whether, again, the simple story could even be true on either level.
Mhm.
I think some of the messiness that Cervantes brings in that, again, we've got someone like Don Quixote doing these amazing feats, half of them in series of delusions, some of them with good outcomes anyhow, is something that gets us closer to the truth than some sort of edited. I mean, imagine if all of Don Quixote's stories resulted in a good ending and only showed happy things about them, and no one ever gotten beat up, and Sancho Panza never had cause to doubt. Wouldn't be half as interesting a story.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, it seems like that's the version of the narrative that Quixote is maintaining in his mind, more or less. So that's kind of running on one track. Is that true? Is there something true about it? That's an interesting question. Marge, go ahead, and then Larry. Sorry, Marge, you're muted. I don't know if you know.
There, sorry, every time. I took it more as a surface level where this was his chance to answer the critics. And I picture everything he mentioned in here was probably a criticism of his part one at some time or another. And it was kind of his chance to answer back. And his catch-all was, well, if you don't like it, it was probably a lie anyway, because this Moorish bloke he's got to be a liar. So it's just kind of another way of keeping the reader on edge, that we don't know who wrote it, who translated it, who's talking half the time. I don't know, I just took it more as this was his chance to say, well, you didn't know why the story of the tale of inappropriate curiosity was in the book, but wasn't it a good tale and well told? And so it's kind of his answer back to what I imagined were what the critics had said about his book in the first place.
Oh, so, and the his there, just to be clear, is Cervantes, right? Not Quixote,
Yes.
narrator.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that seems to work well for 1D, the note that Carrasco's report that readers tended to criticize the history in various ways for inconsistencies in the narrative and for including the tale of inappropriate curiosity that had nothing to do with the story of Don Quixote. Do you think that applies also to, say, anything else in 1A to 1E, or is it?
Yeah, I think it applies to, some of those who've read the history say that they've been happier if its authors had overlooked. And why does it say authors had overlooked some of the countless beatings that Don Quixote received in various confrontations? So he kind of addresses that. It's sort of like, okay, I've heard the critics, I've heard what you said, and I'll give it a nod, but move on.
Huh. It's funny. It's hard for me to imagine people criticizing the first part of Don Quixote for having too many beatings of Don Quixote. I mean, those are all kind of like the fun, juicy parts, or at least among them. But maybe this is all just Cervantes' voice filtering through saying, okay, yeah, I hear you, but I don't care. I'm going to press on with this kind of stuff. It's an interesting thought, Marge. Larry, go ahead, and then Karin.
There's something that follows Don Quixote's comment about the story being recorded as history and factual. The response I thought from Samson was where he writes, but it's one thing to write as a poet and very different to write as a historian. The poet can show us things not as they actually happen, but as they should have happened. But the historian has to record them not as they ought to have been, but as they actually were, without adding or subtracting anything whatever from the truth. And I think this conversation struck me because it foreshadows a conversation that Don Quixote will have. I think it's with the man with the green coat, talking about his son and the importance of poetry.
So that's Don Diego de Miranda. We're going to talk about him hopefully later in the class. So Quixote there gives this impassioned defense of poetry and says, can't be corrupted by being mishandled or paraded about in front of the wrong kinds of people. You know who I'm talking about. So what's the connection? I mean, so the defense that you pointed to, or excuse me, Sanson's reply is at the top of 505 if people want to have a look. So the
Don Quixote to me, Don Quixote is defending his position here, I believe, is that history should be only the facts, without embellishment in terms of, without coloring the story in one way or another. Sampson replies, describes the difference between a poet and historian in his writing, but it will pick up later on in the conversation that Don Quixote has with the man in the green coat, and will reflect back to the conversation that the canon has on drama and art with Quixote.
I mean, Larry, I find it plausible that there is a connection between these meta discussions of poetry and history, but what's the connection? Do you want to, what's the?
Well, my feeling is it's a contradiction. That Don Quixote's comment here is a contradiction of what he'll say later on in our reading for today.
I see. Well, geez, I don't know whether to delay looking at it so that you can explain the contradiction, or whether you should explain it now. This is an interesting thought. Do you want to, what's the nature of the contradiction? Do you want to give us a preview, or?
The contradiction is that I believe Don Quixote says that he should be, any description of him should enhance his image in his historical way, not necessarily embellish it, but to focus strictly on him as a character. You see.
Okay.
And then later on in our reading, as I say, he'll give a defense for poetry, which describes events in a more embellished, perhaps more romantic, more colorful manner.
I'm looking at what I've quoted in question 8 from page 588. Can you point to the sentences where he says what you take to contradict what he says on 504? I mean, there it seems like he's saying poetry is the kind of queen of the other forms of learning. She should make use of all of them. She is made of an alchemy gold of such excellence that she should be highly esteemed. She should be controlled, not allowed to stray into satires or sonnets, baneful sonnets at least. Not be sold unless in heroic poems, tragedies, comedies, well-contrived comedies. Not allowed before the wrong kinds of company, the ignorant, the vulgar. Where in there is the thought that you think is in tension with what Quixote says on 504, or maybe it's elsewhere in this passage?
It seems to contradict his defense of the story written only as history, only as factual information.
So at 504, there is no need to narrate actions that do not alter or undermine the truth of the history if they're going to result in the discrediting of the hero. I'm sure that Aeneas was not as pious as Virgil depicts him, nor was Ulysses as prudent as Homer says. So there he says, look, as long as you, including any facts that would undermine the truth of the history, is not prudent, so long as those facts might result in the discrediting of the hero. Can you just tie it all up? I'm not totally seeing the connections between these two passages that you're. indicating is there, but I think I'm just missing the thought.
Let that percolate in my mind for a little bit, and I'll come back to you.
That's fine. Thank
Yeah,
you for
thank you.
the connection on the table. In any case, I'm sure that reading them alongside one another would be useful. Karen, go ahead.
Well, I was going to point to the exact same passage that Larry just did, but from a different perspective. And I don't know if this adds to the discussion or not, but to me, it was getting back to the idea of what is truth, because here he's saying, oh, well, if it's poetry, it can be embellished. It doesn't have to be exactly as it were, it can be as it should be, which is an idealized version versus, history should be just the facts. And we don't know, actually, I don't think at this point if Don Quixote sees his whole story as poetry or as history.
Yeah.
And, the priests along the way have claimed that this is all nonsense, this knight errantry, because it's not history, which I guess the church would probably agree with this definition, facts as they were. But why does that make the books, why would it make the stories irrelevant if instead they were poetry instead of history? So I feel like he's toying with us a little bit about, which is Don Quixote's story, and and why can't we just accept his story for what it is?
So I mean, and it's tricky because it's a character within the story, a fictional character.
Yeah.
Working about genre, and what he says at the bottom of 504, I agree with you, Karen, is really strange. He says, "There's no need to narrate actions that don't alter or undermine the truth of the history." They will result in discrediting the hero. And then what he cites as examples are two poems, namely Virgil's Aeneid and Homer's Odyssey. Those aren't histories; those are works of poetry. With historical roots, it seems maybe it's kind of hazy. And then but also. Part one of Don Quixote has been called a history by the narrator, or excuse me, the translator. It's being called a history here by Sansón Carrasco. Sansón Carrasco responds to Don Quixote by saying, well, look, historians do one thing and poets do another. So this is really murky, as characteristically so for Cervantes. Are we reading a history, a poem? Should they be judged by related standards? Very unclear. Larry, do you want to return to your thought? And then Charles.
Aaron, I wanted to respond to you. One of the things that strikes me about this novel, it's a novel about writing on writing. It's a novel in which writing, the various genres of writing that we're familiar with, be it history, be it poetry, be it fantasy, whatever. It's all mixed into this novel, it seems to me. And all of those genres, it's like a stew. It's like a big language stew. Go into creating this story. It's drawn from multi-genre points of view.
So maybe Quixote's eliding the difference between kind of fudging it between history and poetry at the bottom of 504 is actually appropriate to the kind of novel that this is. It's a novel that contains a whole bunch of genres. I mean, that thought, Larry, relates clearly to the canon of Toledo's thought about what works of chivalry can do. The good ones can do the things that epics and comedies and tragedies and so forth can do. And maybe that's the kind of book we're reading.
It's like this writing is in its various guises is inventing itself through various through various styles of communication, through various styles of the written word or spoken word.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a challenging thought. Charles, go ahead, and then Cindy.
Well, I don't know if this answers part of the question, but at the top of 505, that's when Sansón says that the poet can narrate or sing events not as they were, but as they should have been, and the historian records them as they were without adding anything to the truth or taking anything away from it. And it seems like to me that that's what's sort of the meat of it, or the main point of it is it doesn't get to, what's truth, but he does make a distinction between poetry and history, at least in the text.
Mhm. Do you think we should just accept that distinction, Charles? I mean, I take it Karin and Larry were pointing to features of the book that indicate we're not on stable ground as far as the genre of what we're reading goes. How should we judge this as a history? Well, it's called a history by a lot of the characters and by the narrator, but it's also clearly a work of fiction. It's almost like we're being set up to hear Sansón Carrasco's distinction as useful when the genre lines are very clear, and when they're not, as like a rope tossed into us as we're drowning that's attached to nothing. It's it's nice to know that in some cases genre distinctions are useful, but what about a text that just doesn't obey genre distinction? What do you think? What are we supposed to make of Sansón Carrasco's thought? Do you have any interpretation of it, Charles?
I think he's trying to lay down the university educated person's view.
Interesting.
Somebody who has, they had it back then, they didn't, but if they had a class in literary criticism, he's sort of spouting off that kind of thing. And so he's, in my view, he's representing that academic genre, I'll call it.
That's interesting. So this, if that reading seems to chime with what Larry was suggesting earlier, that I think it was Larry, that maybe Cervantes is taking a dig at universities and their students with this kind of a comment. So Carrasco's got this official line. You want to know about what poetry and history are? Here's what you need to know. And Cervantes is kind of undermining that claim with
Yes.
the ambiguity of the genres in the novel, even as the character he wants to make look foolish asserts it as the kind of authoritative truth about history and poetry. It's an interesting thought. Cindy, go ahead.
So I understand these discussions of the distinction between history and poetry and plays, and I was a little confused why we think this is a history. Like, why would we assume this is a history? So back to the kind of place you cited, apparently who you are calling a translator, I guess I had not thought of him as directly translating, but he does find this book. So you were on 76, on 75, the book he finds that he gets excited about is called History of Don Quixote de la Mancha, written by Cide Hamed Benengeli, an Arab historian. So whatever Cide wrote, he called a history, and he was a historian. But we can't forget about the prologue, where basically our translator, writer, author is agreeing with his friend that this is really written for this purpose of showing the danger of works of chivalry, and ergo it's okay to phony up the footnotes and write your own sonnets, which he I don't know if he phonied up the footnotes, but he certainly wrote his own sonnets. And then if you look at the title of his book, I had to go back to that. He doesn't say it's a history of Don Quixote, does he? It's the ingenious Hidalgo Don Quixote. So I guess I'm saying I'm equally confused, but I understand the distinction that Sansón may make between a history and a poetry, though I think anybody who's studied history knows that history, there's all sorts of things about it's the stuff history is the story written by the victor, right? Like you leave the stuff out you don't want other people to see. It all has to do with perspective. But separate and apart from that, one thinks they can distinguish between what is at least labeled a history and poetry, right? We think that. And C-Day labeled what he wrote a history, but I don't think Cervantes certainly labeled that a history. Or, I'm sorry, not Cervantes. The guy who wrote the prologue, who's our narrator, is suggesting that his book is the history. So clearly you can see I was confused from the very beginning of this.
Yeah. I mean, I think the narrator, whoever that is, calls it a history within the body of the story, but that does not mean in that frame, the prologue, it's called a history. I would have to look back. So, I mean, and here Carrasco calls it a history. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, who have lived through it, seem to think it's a history, but they're fictional characters, of course. So that's an odd one to disentangle, excuse me. Yeah, I agree with you, Cynthia. I mean, my head is spinning if I try to come up with a genre. Steve, your hand went up and went down. Do you want to?
It's always along the same lines. I don't have Herodotus at hand, but I believe Herodotus describes his book as history. And I think that, again, to me, I think that Cervantes is playing at the whole notion. Everything from, does the fact that an author or an alleged author calls it a history make it a history? Is the whole distinction false? Okay. Or is the treating it as a history or poetry something that we, the reader, superimpose on it? And I'm thinking of the one place he doesn't go, which is the Bible. Okay. Whether you read this as a history or poetry or some blend in between has in some ways more to do with us and how we want to approach the text than the text itself.
So depending on what we call it, we're going to take different attitudes towards the text. Sometimes we think those attitudes are justified by some independent quality of the texts. Histories are researched and depend on facts, and poetry, works of poetry are not necessarily. But it could be, I take it you're suggesting, Steve, that our attitudes follow from the identifications that we make. This is history, that's poetry, which need not themselves be predicated on a real distinction between the kinds of texts that we affix these labels to. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, again, the whole notion of, is it a history? Is it poetry? Who determines that? Which one is more true? I think all these questions, kind of tie to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, again, it is a mild slap back at the academic pretending to know. I know the answer to this question. Well, the answer is no, because there is no clear answer to the question.
Okay, so it's just a kind of note to urge us to be skeptical and humble about the process by which we categorize, which itself is full of arbitrary moves and not grounded in any fact of the matter, that the librarian gets to easily sort certain texts into one section and others into another. Rimas, you had your hand up, and then April.
Yeah, I have to admit that my head is also spinning, and I'm trying to figure out the chronology, and the chronology doesn't make sense. And it seems to me that maybe Cervantes purposely made it that way. Because if you think about this as, here's what happened to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza until a certain point before their third sally. And someone, presumably this Arab historian, found out about this whole thing and wrote a book calling it The History. This book is printed and 12,000 copies are distributed. People are reading it. And now Don Quixote, has he read his own book And now before he starts his third adventure, he's criticizing what has been written by this Arab historian. How did this happen time-wise? I can't figure it out.
Well, I think Quixote has an explanation, which is that this Arab historian is a sage or enchanter. So he kind of he's omniscient. But I'm not sure that should satisfy us if we're trying to get to the bottom of the kind of question that you're asking, Rumus, namely, somebody give me a way of understanding how these events, as they're being presented, could have unfolded in the way they do, keeping the laws of the universe as we know them constant. And maybe there's just no way to do that within this fictional narrative. April, go ahead.
I did find it interesting that many times in the reading for today, the author kept saying, well, this is a true history. This is a true history. And I feel like Cervantes wants to anchor us in one genre so that he can break those rules and become something different. And I think breaking that pattern is where the sizzle happens in the story. We're expecting one thing, we're given another, and trying to puzzle that through is what makes it very exciting. Everyone said, like, I'm totally lost, like what's happening, what, who did what when. I think that's the strategy of the author, is to get you to a point of confusion, to try to anchor you in a genre or a pattern that you understand, and then just blow it out of the water, but then keep luring you back saying, well, remember, this is a history. Remember, this is true. And I think that's what makes it really exciting.
I mean, that's interesting, April. That makes it seem as if there's another paradox in this comment too. If you bear with me, I'll explain. It's almost like by disorienting us in making us feel as if we're in one kind of genre of story, but then not enabling us to stick with that genre. Cervantes is making it easier for us to see that he's drawing on a kind of older set of traditions and messing with the rules of them, or departing from those rules, flouting them deliberately so as to do something new. It would be harder to see that he's trying to do something new if he weren't raising the prospect of the rules governing other genres and then flouting them. So in a way, the disorientation is actually kind of orienting. That's what I see as the paradox in what you're saying. It's easier to announce, a revolution is at hand when you keep talking about the old order of things. That's an interesting thought. Any thoughts about 1E? We haven't talked about 1E. And I want to know what to think about this. So Carrasco says on 507, all in all, this history provides the most delightful and least harmful entertainment ever, because nowhere in it can one find the slightest suspicion of language that isn't wholesome or thoughts that aren't Catholic. I don't know how to take that. Is that meant to be taken seriously? Is it right? Is it kind of right in a strange sense? Is it just clearly wrong and so funny because it's satirical, or lands with a thud? What do you think? And what does it mean in the first place? Does anyone have thoughts about this? I mean, religion is going to come up again in the discussions of religion at great length in the not for the first time in the chapters we read for today. So any thoughts about this? Steve?
At one angle, you could look at it simply being a preemptive strike, which is there are an awful lot of things in the book that border on parody of the Catholic Church, parody of the priests, and you can read them all in multiple different ways. Mm-hmm. You can read the canon and the priests sympathetically and look at them as compassionate individuals, or you can look at their total hypocrisy relative to the book burnings and things like that. And to some degree, this strikes me as being, again, potentially true on one level. He's saying there's nothing in here which you as a believer should be offended by. But it's also a preemptive strike, asserting his kind of innocence in the same way. I mean, to some degree, all his commentaries on, they thought this was a mistake and they caught this thing, strikes me almost as a rebuttal letter to the editor. Okay, there was a critical review which came out, and it's like, your critical review trashed all over my book. Let me set this guy straight. Okay, and this is kind of an annex to that letter to the editor. Okay, it may have not said that I'm a blasphemous heathen or going into what territory, and I'm saying not so.
Mhm.
On a level
Okay.
of higher truth, I'm saying nothing that that should offend you at a religious level.
So this is then the same species of remark as Carrasco's note that readers tended to criticize the history for including a tale of inappropriate curiosity, the consideration of like continuity problems in part one. With all these, Cervantes is saying, look, I know you're inclined to find problems in what I wrote. Don't worry about it, at least with this one. Everything I wrote is meant to be in line with the recognition of the authority of the church and its hierarchy and its dogma. Okay, yeah, it's an interesting thought. Charles, go ahead, and then Cindy.
I thought 1E was a way for Cervantes, through the mouth of the university scholar, to avoid the Catholic Church's censors. And he's throwing that in there to let them know that, no, this is really not what you think it is, and therefore, so don't come down on me and don't start ripping out pages.
So, I mean, do you think that that this is like a smokescreen and Sanson Carrasco is a false pleader? He's saying there's nothing un-Catholic in part one and maybe by implication in part two, but really there was plenty that's un-Catholic in there? Or is he trying to tell the truth as Cervantes understands it, namely that there really isn't anything that isn't wholesome or Catholic in either part? Do you have any reading of that, Charles?
The easy answer is both.
Oh. Yeah,
But
you say easy, that spins my head a little bit. Go ahead.
but I really think it's more of a smokescreen.
Okay, Cindy.
I don't know why I think that, but that I do.
I mean, yeah, that seems to fit with what Steve was saying.
I was just looking at where this was in this whole discussion, and this Carrasco guy he's really excited about this, I think. And this is the end of a paragraph in which he is, Don Quixote's trying to get into it's not true, it's if it's a history, he's getting in, and it's almost, although Carrasco talks about it in other places, at this point he's starting to say, he's basically making the argument, everyone's reading, kids read it, the page guys, the page, what is it? The page boys read it. The old men praise it. People, it's like a meme. There's a Rocinante. There's a Sancho Panza. And he basically is saying this is just so delightful, and really there's nothing in it offensive. I don't know if maybe saying aren't Catholic, I don't know if it's as pointed towards religion, and I suppose in Spain that would be important. But I think he's right. I mean, if there was something that was anti-Catholic earlier, I guess I kind of missed it. And at the end, towards the end of this chapter, he's really arguing the entertainment value of it is the most important thing about it. And therefore, since it entertains all these people, and the argument people was, well, who's being hurt by this? People are enjoying this, nothing being hurt. They don't use bad language and they don't insult the church. And Don Quixote is still a little worried about, well, how do I look in this? But for Carrasco, he's more saying, look how entertaining this is, and it's not offensive. So that's what I read it as, part and parcel of kind of that. And he's almost shifting away from what he was saying about history earlier, and kind of saying, well, whatever, it's still, everybody's reading it, everybody's enjoying it, and nothing is hurt by it. And that's its value. So that's what I understood it to be. And maybe it's a more pointed, defense on Catholicism, but he never says that any of the criticisms was that it was anti-Catholic, which I guess he could have thrown in. It was more like, what happened to the 100 Escudos? Everybody's like mad that the whole thing ended and nobody knows what happens to the Escudos, right? Those are the kind of criticisms.
Not the kind of thing that's going to get part 1 censored or
Right, yeah.
get Cervantes in trouble.
Yeah, that's going to offend the Pope.
Okay, well, with question 2, we're in the same territory. So why don't I just raise it formally and see what you all think. At the beginning of chapter 5, we hear this note from I call him the translator, you might call him the author, whatever, notes that he thinks chapter 5 is apocryphal because in it, and this is something that you'll see continuing over the course of part 2, Sancho Panza's character has really changed. The way he speaks changes a lot in part 2. Panza speaks in a manner that's out of character for him. There are notes to this effect on 514, 517, 519. And then there are these other continuity errors, or at least there's one very glaring one, which is that Sancho's wife, who was called Teresa in part, it was called Juana in part 1, is called Teresa in part 2, Teresa. Is Cervantes doing that intentionally to just like include a continuity error to wink about his past involuntary continuity errors? What is going on with this? Karen?
For some reason, I noticed that discrepancy right away and it really bugged me. So I started wondering if it was somehow related to the names. So I looked up the origin of the names, and Juana is a name for a whore. Juana comes from the word whore in Spanish. I mean, that's what I found in the dictionary.
Wow. That's a big surprise to me. It's a very common Spanish name.
I know, but I mean, apparently, originally that was one of the. I mean, I just read what it said in the dictionary. Somebody else can look it up and check me on it. So when I saw that, then it got me thinking that maybe he decided it was an inappropriate name for her, or but there's no question that also her personality changes between the first book and the second book. She's sort of a nag in the first book. In the second book, he and Teresa are having these more like husband and wife dialogues, about what is the right and the wrong thing to do. So anyway, just wanted to share that little tidbit because
Yeah,
I thought it was interesting.
So do you have an interpretation? Why do you think Cervantes is doing this? Why include from Carrasco criticisms of continuity errors in part 1, a note at the beginning of chapter 5 that he thinks this chapter is apocryphal, the writer, and then this sudden unannounced change of name in Sancho's wife? What is going on here? Is Cervantes just having more fun with us by confirming the criticisms that Carrasco has said other readers have had of part 1? Cindy?
I think maybe because apparently it is true you don't know what happened with the 100 Escudos, and it is a little confusing. When does the donkey come back, really, right? So he probably wrote the whole thing and made a couple of mistakes, and of course people are making a deal about it. And I think he did this on purpose because in the part where he talks about Juana Panza on 473, he made such a big deal about her name. This is her name. It was her name because they're not blood relations, but it's the custom. Don't be in such a hurry, Juana. And then in the next page as well, Sancho Panza and his wife, Juana Panza. So he knows that it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. Like he picks the thing, to me, to like say, see, I can do it again almost. Because I don't know that he made a point of doing that. He didn't know what the criticism. I'm just thinking he went back to say, well, what can I really make clear that I'm kind of, sticking my finger up to these critics who are pointing out these minor little problems with things that shouldn't make that much difference. And he said, well, I couldn't have been clearer that her name was Juana, so let's call her Teresa. So I think there may be a part of that. The apocryphal thing, though, I think is different, because that means that what he's suggesting, that those chapters may not be true, because he is speaking in a manner that we haven't seen him speak before. So here he's saying, this is the chapter, but this may be false, because look how, I mean, the difference in the way Sancho Panza speaks in this is startling, actually. He seems to have taken on a lot of the way Don Quixote spoke, and it's really noticeable. But the fact that then the author would say, so here's the chapter, but I'm not so sure about this, because look at how Sancho's speaking, is really just another level on the truth thing. So those, to me, that's two different things, the way he speaks and but I thought the change in the wife's name could be really purposeful on his part, to say, oh, so what?
And you think they're both intentional means on Cervantes' part, or attempts on Cervantes' part, to mess with our sense of the reliability of the narrative. Is that right?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how long Sancho Panza is going to continue to sound like this, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, he didn't but he's very different. So yeah, I think and I don't know what the time frame is between writing part 1 and writing part 2.
About 9 years. I think.
But it's also kind of authorial, is that the right word? Control. Like, I get to do this, you know? And it isn't, I get to do this. It's kind of like but the whole thing about it being apocryphal, I think, is extremely adding to the level of confusion.
Okay.
I thought the other thing added to the confusion, but was more purposeful.
Got it. Thank you, Cindy. Steve and then March.
You're on mute.
Got it. Okay. I think the notion that Cervantes is very deliberately signaling that something's going to be different about Sancho going forward. I think this is a narrative reset, because yes, that one particular paragraph could be identified as being apocryphal, but Sancho is, in the 100 pages that we're reading today, this is a different Sancho in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
He's much craftier. I mean, the whole notion, which we'll get to later on, of, rather than trying to talk Don Quixote out of his fantasies, he very cleverly creates a fantasy, pretends that, that Don Quixote is indeed enchanted because he can't see that Dulcinea is as beautiful as everyone else can see. That's a level of thinking that I don't think would have occurred to the Sancho of the first book. So again, I don't know to what degree Sancho returns to that to the book 1 Sancho, but I think this is just Cervantes kind of giving us a heads up. I'm making a shift, and I know it, and you should know it.
Do you have any idea why he's doing this, Steve? Do you have any interpretation, hypothesis? Why change Sancho?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any hypothesis about why Cervantes is changing Sancho in this way?
It is purely a hypothesis, which is he wants to, kind of going half back. The first book feels a lot like this happened and then that happened. And very possibly that the first Sally, was like, it's almost like someone's writing a book and then realizes, wow, there's a much bigger story here. And it kind of grows itself out organically. I think he's signaling that this second book is going to be different. and that it's more that he's kind of thought through holistically. And I think he's just putting a stake in the ground relative to this is the Sancho you're going to see going forward. I mean, it's all apocryphal. Again, we get back into the, is it true or is it fiction? But calling one of your characters in one of the scenes out as being apocryphal is a little bit like City said with the, on one page it's Juana and on the next page it's Teresa. Okay, we're meant to see that.
Okay, great. So the first sally is Quixote alone. It's the sally in which he gets knighted at the first inn where he stays. The second one is changed because Sancho Panza is along. The dynamic on the sally is, you know, totally transformed, the kind of story it is. And here on this hypothesis, Quixote is announced, or excuse me, Cervantes is announcing there is another revolution afoot. We're getting a third story that we should expect a dramatic break from the second, whatever the nature of that break is going to be. That's a great sort of frame for us to pile material on top of. Okay, so I've seen hands from Marge, Remus, and then John. If anybody else has enough raising that question. Marge, go ahead.
I was agreeing with Steve, actually. I saw the same thing. This is sort of notice that Sancho, hey, pay attention, Sancho's changing. He actually is, so far anyway, the only character in the book that really does develop and change, from what I understand. So I think he's becoming kind of the primary, he's primary character, obviously. And not only is he developed, but the relationship between Don Quixote and Sancho changes and develops. And I think that kind of gives you notice that that's happening as well. The most noticeable thing was Don Quixote now is happy to talk to Sancho. He encourages conversation, which he discouraged it in book one. So I just think it's really developing the character and the relationship between the two main characters.
I haven't asked about it, but there's a nice passage on 558 in which Sancho gives a characterization of, I think, the kind of thing that you're describing, Marge, of the way that Sancho is changing as a character. So there's at least a reading internal to the text, whether it's reliable because of that, who knows, as to what the nature of this change is. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but basically Quixote says, he gives this kind of hackneyed illustration of what life is by using as an analogy the players in a play. And Sancho says, oh yeah, that one, people use that all the time. Likewise for chess pieces, they all have different roles on the board, but then they're in the same box. And Quixote says, with every day that passes by, dear Sancho, you lose some foolishness and gain some sense. And Sancho says, yes, some of your good sense is bound to stick onto me. Soil that left to itself would be poor and sterile, gives good yields when you manure it and you till it. What I'm trying to say is that being with you is the manure that's been spread over the barren soil of my poor wits. And the tilling is all the time I've been with you, serving you. So I'm hoping to give wonderful yields that won't be unworthy to be piled up beside the good paths, the paths of good breeding that you've trodden over this feeble understanding of mine. A thought that's both vulgar and poetically expressed. It's perfect kind of Sancho 2.0. Anyway, so he's got a reading of what changed, that Quixote's wit is growing on him, and or I guess his company is the manure that's being spread over the soil of Sancho's wits and making him wiser. What that means for us as readers, whether we have to accept that hypothesis, I don't know, but it's at least one. All right. Sorry, who was next? Remus, you were next, and then John, and then Karen.
Well, I agree with this idea of a shift. The thought of role reversal came to my mind because, like in part one, it's Don Quixote who's saying, I'm going to attack those giants. And Sancho is, those aren't giants, those are windmills. Whereas here we have Sancho saying, here, Don Quixote, there's Dulcinea with her two maids. And it's Don Quixote was saying, that's not Dulcinea, those are three peasant girls. So there is a shift here, and I also feel that there's a shift with Don Quixote. There seems to be that he has a little bit of a melancholy has creeped into him. He's not as self-confident, as forceful as he was before.
And is that in his encounter with Dulcinea, or more generally, with the fake Dulcinea, fake? I don't know what to call it.
I can't put my finger on it, but I thought there were some passages where he almost felt sort of like, is it worth going on? And I never had that feeling in part one. He was gung-ho.
Interesting. So the first thought was, and tell me if this is right, Rimis, unlike in part one, although I'm wondering what you think about, say, Sancho's delivery of the letter from Dulcinea that he says, the response from Dulcinea that he says came from her, when of course it didn't, and Sancho was just covering his tracks. But here, you're saying, unlike in part one, Sancho is actively participating in the construction of the fantasy that Quixote is maintaining. He's saying that's Dulcinea riding with two beautiful maidens, when in fact it's just peasant girls. And that's an indication that Sancho is becoming more Quixote-like. Is that right?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
okay. Thank you. John, go ahead, and then Karen.
Continuing on the theme of what's the deal with the change, particularly in Sancho, but I think Sancho and Don Quixote changed. I think, especially when you look at the dialogue between him and the other character on poetry, it almost makes me wonder whether, I mean, it was 10 years later that he wrote this. Did he sit down, Cervantes, sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write another 500 pages? Do I, or does my audience want to see 500 more pages of dim-witted slapstick between these guys? And can I get away with more side stories with other people that I've been criticized about? I got to develop these guys. I got to show more than just dim-witted slapstick. And clearly the dialogue so far in the first 120 pages or whatever we've read so far in the second part, they're showing a lot more intelligence. I mean, they're definitely showing some dim-wittedness at times, but there's a lot more intelligent dialogue, and the humor is a lot more clever than the first book. I think at times you just read a really good one that was the biggest, weirdest left-handed compliment I've ever heard. And so I just wonder if it was literally a conscious decision by the author to change it up a little bit so he doesn't bore himself and his audience.
Okay, so this is like the Cervantes gauging audience appetite theory of the change. He's making changes in Sancho and Quixote in order to inject some variety into the story, maybe use a few new tricks rather than the same old set of tricks.
Part of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Karen, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say exactly what John just said. So just to build on the point, you know, that I think he probably felt like the first book had run its course, you know, and then there was that 10-year gap where it took another author to convince him that there was enough interest in more, right? Because that other book came out that he's responding to. And what I would add is that as an author, if I was going to make a change, it would be risky to change the essence of the main character, because this is a beloved character who people are really connected to. The smartest thing to do would be to change the foil, which is the key supporting character, you know, who is Sancho, right? And so just by, you know, making that change that we're seeing in Sancho, he can create, whole new angles into the stories and sort of re-energize, what Don Quixote is all about. So it seems like, you asked why, it seems like a very smart move on the part of a author looking for new material and a way to make the story more interesting again.
That's an interesting thought. So it's almost like with a sequel on between this thought, Karen, and John's,
Yeah.
there's a sense that the audience demands continuity of a certain kind, but also change of a certain kind. And there's a safe kind of change to make, namely to the secondary, the second of the two main characters, not the title character, that allows you to provide continuity because Quixote stays stable across the two the two parts, but you get variety with the change to his number two, Sancho Panza.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, that's a common belief even today. So for all of you who just watched the Super Bowl on Sunday, the whole discussion that advertisers have is, what is the main positioning of the brand? Like, Don Quixote is the brand. We're not going to change the brand, but we can change, the key story around him so that we get new attention and new interest. And, maybe he was thinking along those lines.
Interesting, yeah. It's a blockbuster franchise, a branded product.
Right. Don't throw it away. Just find a way to make it new again.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about question 2 before I move us on? All right. So Rimas mentioned another instance in which a character other than Quixote exploits Quixote's illusion. The second time we see it in what we read for today is when Sancho Panza does it, in referring to these 3 peasant girls as 3 beautiful maidens, one of whom is meant to be Dulcinea. Here, Sansón Carrasco does it at around 529 to 531. Yeah, that's right. The difference that I noted is that, the barber, Dorotea, the priest have done something similar at the inn, played into Quixote's illusions for the sake of getting Quixote home, and as a kind of sideline on that, for the sake of having a little fun, as with in the discussion we talked about how they mess with the barber who's lost his basin that they swear is Membrino's helmet back at the end. Here, Sansón Carrasco seems to do it to drive Quixote in the opposite direction, into danger, or into what the priest and the barber and Dorotea and all the assembled company at the inn regarded as danger. What do you think? The difference seems meaningful, but I don't know how to interpret it. The one party exploits Quixote's illusions, nurtures them in order to get him home. The other, Sansón Carrasco, does the same thing, but in order to drive Quixote out onto the road again. Any thoughts about this difference? What's going on here? You can take up 3B alongside this if you want. The fact that for whatever reason, Carrasco is later scheming to try to get Quixote back home by defeating him in battle. But Steve, go ahead.
Well, I think you have to look at that in the context of how the story plays out later in the section, which is there's a bit of premeditation going on here in the narrative, in the way Cervantes is constructing the narrative, that I don't think we actually saw very much of, or certainly it was not as artfully done as it is here, which is what Carrasco is doing at this point is somewhat inexplicable. What he's doing or says he's doing later on after they have the fight, the whole notion was, this guy's still mad. Okay, we need to give him tougher medicine. And the way we do this is we send him off, we go out, we challenge him to the duel, he loses, he comes under our sway, and we can bring him home. So I think that at this point, if we were stopping here, it'd be an open-ended discussion. But I think here, this is the first seed of the plot goes awry, which then turns into the whole big revenge twist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the thought is, tell me if this is right, Steve. It's only by chapters 12 to 15, really chapter 15, that we learn what Sansón Carrasco was up to in what chapter is it on 529? I haven't written it down. In chapter 7, namely, he, the priest and the barber, had determined, as soon as Sansón Carrasco shows up in the narrative, Quixote is still mad. The only way we can cure him is to send him out on the road and have him be defeated by an anonymous knight. Maybe that will keep him home for good, and otherwise we have no hope of curing
Well,
him.
yeah, it's a, we can't cure him of his madness. Maybe we can manipulate the madness into getting us a happy ending.
Okay.
Okay.
Otherwise, he's liable to wander again. Is that the idea?
Right.
Otherwise, he's going to spin out of control, and who knows what will happen to him and to everybody else involved.
That's interesting. I mean, so what just came to mind is there's an old This American Life, which I listen to all the time, about I think it's a home maybe in Germany for people with autism, in which they constructed, or excuse me, not autism, Alzheimer's, in which they constructed a fake bus stop near the facility, so that people who would wander would go and sit at that bus stop as if they were going to meet a bus, but of course no bus came to the bus stop. So it's as if Carrasco has seeded Quixote with an adventure that's going to be a controlled one. They're going to safely supervise what's going on with him. The outcome is predetermined, and what's going to happen is that they're going to get Quixote back home and cure him of his desire to wander further.
Right. And the corollary would be if a real bus showed up at that fake bus stop and everybody got on.
That's what happens in
Yes.
Don Quixote. Okay, right. In Carrasco's failure is like the real bus showing up. Okay, thank you. Rimas, was that a hand?
Just a minor detail maybe, but initially when Carrasco was talking, he was saying, "And make me your squire. I'll be happy to be your squire." So in a sense, he's already planning, get Sancho out of the way. I'll be with Don Quixote and I'll be able to control what happens.
So this is still consonant with Steve's
Yeah.
reading, that
Yes.
Carrasco is trying presumably, if he's going to serve as Quixote's squire, he doesn't yet have in mind the idea that he'll defeat Quixote in battle as a knight, but he's has some other means of turning Quixote back home in mind at that point. The idea is we're going to send him out, have him learn his lesson in some hard way through experience, and then get turned back home somehow. Is that right, Rimas?
Perhaps it's not spelled out, but I remember reading that in praising Don Quixote, he also offered to be his squire.
So let me just mark that on this reading, the Steve and Rimas reading, where they overlap at least, if I don't know whether Steve would about this reading that Rimas has offered, but it's not that the priest, the barber, Dorotea, and the others at the inn exploit Quixote's delusions for one purpose, and Sansón Carrasco exploits Quixote's delusions for a different purpose. It's the same purpose all along, namely to protect Quixote from the dangers of his sallies. So that's a way of resolving at least explaining how the difference that I've noted that frames question 3A. Did anyone have any other readings of this moment? Larry?
For some reason, I have the feeling that Carrasco has a lot of self-interest in this, that his motives are not altruistic, that he's in it for his own gain.
Why do you think so? Any ideas?
It's more intuitive. It's more of a feeling than perhaps a fact. It's the way he presents, the way he urges Don Quixote out into his third sally. I'm looking at chapter 7,
Mhm.
where Carrasco gives the housekeeper a reason for Don Quixote going out. It reads, may Madam Housekeeper here leave off her recitation of the prayer to Saint Apollonia, for I know it is the fixed decision of the spheres. It's almost as if he's saying that fate is suggesting that fate should be driving Don Quixote out to his third adventure. The fixed decision of the spheres that my lord Don Quixote once more put into practice his noble novel plans, and it would much trouble my conscience if I did not urge this knight not to delay a moment longer, holding back the might of his powerful arm and the goodness of this bravest of souls, because for him to dally is to defraud the world of its righter of wrongs, its protector of orphans, its preserver of virginal chastity, its patron of all widows and supporter of women still married, and many other matters of the same sort, and so forth. I read this as complete hyperbole on the part of Carrasco, that he's just just playing to Don Quixote for his own, meaning Carrasco's own self-interest and benefit.
I mean, one thought, my intuition when I read this was that Carrasco really likes the story of Don Quixote and he wants more of it. And he's like kind of a fan urging the character in his favorite book to go make more of the same book or another sequel, But Larry, what do you think? Is he doing this? Is he engaging in this hyperbole out of that kind of interest, or is there other kind of?
What would it mean for Carrasco disguised as a knight to defeat Don Quixote, the greatest of all knights, and send him packing? What would it do to Carrasco's, capital?
Do you think that Carrasco really believes that Quixote is the greatest of all knights?
No. But no, I don't think that he does actually think that. But what would it mean for him as a student disguised as a knight to defeat this guy?
Yeah, it's like a walk-on appearance in your favorite TV show. It's a little bit of fame by getting in on the comic.
It's a lot of fame. It represents a lot of fame for Carrasco, it seems to me.
Uh-huh.
And this is where I get the notion of his self-interest. Okay,
so this is not all altruism.
Not at all.
It may be incidentally. I mean, I take it you're reading. Maybe tell me if I'm wrong about this, Larry. That you're reading is consonant with Stephen Rimmes, or at least compatible with Stephen Rimmes's reading, in that it could be that Carrasco is after two things. He thinks the priest and the barber are right, that Quixote should go out, learn his lesson, and be brought back home. But in the meantime, he's gonna, get his win fame, and have a walk-on party.
Carrasco can capitalize on this.
Yeah. So there might be a little bit of altruism. We're going to do what's good for Quixote and what's good for Carrasco with this scheme. Or do you think that Carrasco has no interest in doing what's good for Quixote?
It's too early for me to lay my cards on the table. I have to see how the story unfolds.
Okay, fair enough. Cindy?
So when I read his encouragement of Don Quixote go forward tour, I also thought it was because he was just so excited about this guy, and he was just he's this young kid who's kind of just enjoying this story, and he had some conversation with the housekeeper. Basically, he didn't see the harm in it. I was actually really surprised that this was all part of a plan. you know, which we don't get until 580. That this was just part of a plan, but you have to think that he is this young, you know, strong guy seeing this beat up old guy, right? Figures there's no way he's not, and he sets it up. Now, when I win, you have to follow me. He sees himself as being very heroic there. So I think it kind of fits in with what people are saying is he's, you know, he'd like to be a hero, and he can't see a way that he could possibly lose because of this old fool. And then he does. I mean, you know, it's like he gets really hurt. And all of a sudden, he's like, I have nothing left but a desire for vengeance. I mean, he doesn't, the other guy, the guy's playing his squire, said, well, we were kind of like a couple old idiots. We chose to be mad, and look what happened to us. And Carrasco's not really looking at it that way. He's basically saying, if you think I'm going home until I've gotten Don Quixote a good hiding, you've got another thing coming. And I'm going to search him out now and the only thing that's motivating me is a desire for revenge. Somebody here calls him like a hothead, and I think that's pretty much what he is. Like, he started out thinking, I'm this young guy, and this is going to be really easy. And then when he was made a fool of, he really couldn't deal with it. So now he's out for revenge.
Mhm.
But I was surprised because I bought the whole thing about Don Quixote, go out, you know, be a knight errant is kind of a youthful idealism, but I really believed it. And then I really was disappointed to hear it was all part of a plot. So I guess that was my reading. I had an original reading of it that just ended up being apparently wrong.
Okay, but
Go ahead.
given a few reasons for thinking, adding some evidence that supports Larry's hypothesis that
Right.
Sansón Carrasco is out for himself. He exhibits the ambition and overconfidence of youth, which is actually kind of Quixote-like, although Quixote is not young enough to have an excuse. And as soon as he's defeated, he swears revenge, which is not an altruistic thought or motive. Both of things, those are both points in favor of Larry's reading. It's 7:33 my time, so I'm gonna say let's take 15 minutes, and I'll see you all at 7:48 my time. See you then. Okay, so people who can hear me, I sort of rushed through the end of my response to Cindy's last thought because I realized we were 3 minutes into the break, but any other thoughts about question 3? How we understand the apparent reversal in Carrasco's intentions in exploiting Quixote's delusion, how you square Carrasco's encouraging Quixote to make a third sally, and then his attempt to defeat Quixote in battle and steer him back home. Thoughts about Carrasco's psychology that we've brought up. Anything on this this topic? Okay, then let me raise question 4. So in chapter 8, on 536 to 538, there's this discussion of between Quixote and Sancho Panza about how to think about knight errantry in relation to Christianity. And there's a few interesting points here. One is this speech on 536 that I pointed to, in which Quixote says it's the knight errant has to slay all of the 7 deadly sins, but interestingly omits greed for reasons that I don't know if there's a good reason for that. And then, you know, for instance, another thing that jumps out at me if calls out for interpretation is his response to Sancho on page 538. When Sancho is comparing friars with knights errant, and Quixote says, we can't all be friars, and many are the roads along which God leads his people to heaven. Chivalry is a religion, and there are knights who are saints in glory. that's kind of tossed off without much explanation. Chivalry is a religion. It's a theme that Cervantes has been flirting with in one way or another all through part one, but here Quixote just comes right out and says it. I don't know what to make of that. If you all have thoughts, I'd be curious. Any thoughts about this discussion between Quixote and Sancho about how to think about knight errantry or chivalry in relation to religion or Christianity? Any thoughts? Steve?
I guess the headline is, this strikes me as being more continuous than anything else. I mean, Quixote certainly sees himself as a Christian knight. I mean, that he reaffirms that multiple times throughout the first part. And I think it's not as, I need to underscore that, but it's like he's breathing the air. Okay, this is, the reason why I could say that all Moors are slime is because there are no Moors in the neighborhood. And that, this is one of the things where, interesting question whether he's actually ever met a Moor, or is meant to have met one. I mean, it's just one of those things. So I think that, but the interesting kind of theological discussion of the pagan knights end in hell, where Christian knights get to go to purgatory or heaven. I'm to some degree, he's reinforcing his bona fides with the Catholic Church on that one. But I think that it's funny. I mean, my reaction is less to that than meets the eye in terms of being anything other than reassuring the reader that you're in a good Christian world.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that note on 538, knight errantry is its own religion? What does it say? Chivalry is a religion, and there are knights who are saints in glory. I mean, is that just orthodoxy, or the closest that you can get to affirming Catholic doctrine, authoritative doctrine, while also claiming some kind of glory for knight errantry? Or is this more dangerous? What do you think?
There's no obvious right interpretation for me on that one. I think that he plays, again, this just may be the 21st century person seeing subtle digs at the church if you read things a certain way. And I'm just not sure in the context of the text screams, yes, I'm being subtly blasphemous here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I don't think there are any, any digs are always ambiguous or kind of coded or oblique. And it's not clear whether they're digs or kind of endorsements of the value of religion, or of whether that's the church's version of it, or whether, even if you're going to sort of criticize the church Catholic hierarchy, you affirm the value of the true religion, the true church. All of that seems possible to me. I'm not sure where to land on about any of that. Larry, go ahead, and then Gary.
I was thinking, originally when I read this, I was thinking in the context of looking at knight errantry being separate from Christianity. But then I started thinking about some of the common goals between the two belief systems. And it struck me as that there's some cross-fertilization in terms of some of the objectives that both try to achieve, in terms of uplifting the downtrodden, protecting the weak, doing good in the world, a certain virtuosity. And I was thinking, well, maybe they're not so far apart, after all, that maybe they're running along the same plane.
Right. So now I'm going to try to look through my notes to find it. Earlier in part one, Quixote has said I think maybe to the canon, although I could be wrong about that saints or people who are clerics or custodians of souls or something like that, achieve by a different means something very similar to what knights errant are trying to achieve. It's just that knights errant try to realize something like God's kingdom or God's justice on earth by virtue of deeds, whereas priests and friars and monks and so forth do it by means of study and shepherding the flock. And so there's already earlier in the novel, I think, good evidence for the reading that you're working with, Larry, that Quixote sees himself as, one branch of the Catholic or Christian service to mankind, doing God's works on earth. Gary, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, effectively, it seems to me at just at the level of the simplest level of the story, chivalry is Quixote's religion. There is no difference. It's everything about the way he believes he's living his life. All of the sort of, moral precepts that are supposed to guide your existence are the chivalric ones, which, so it is what for a completely pious person would be viewed as their religion. And I think the other thing that's worth saying, and maybe we've said this other ways, is, I mean, it seems to me that religion is part of everything in this novel and part of everything in Spain of this period. From whatever Cervantes is trying to do and pointing out, the hypocrisies of the church or the inconsistencies of the church, there's never any question about the sort of fundamental role of the church in everyone's day-to-day lives. And every character at some point makes reference, I think, to that. So whatever, and I'm with a lot of people who don't completely know yet what Cervantes' view is of the church. But there doesn't seem to be any question of its fundamental role in everyone's life. It's never really questioned.
I mean, okay, so I'm going to ask you about a reading of a line that we talked about last time then, in light of this, Gary. So on 452, the canon of Toledo, he's in the process of condemning the bad books of chivalry that he's on about. And he says that one thing that they do that he condemns is that they invent new sects and new ways of life. And you said, for Quixote, chivalry is his religion. He flies the banner, I think this is your reading, of chivalry under the larger banner of the church. He takes himself to be a kind of good Catholic, and in the way that I take it you're saying the Catholic Church structures the lives of all characters in the novel, or all people in Spain in this period in some degree. So what do you make in light of that, of the canon repudiating Quixote's way of life as a properly Catholic one? He's saying this is, at least this is my interpretation, by implication, Quixote is innovating, he's creating a new sect, or maybe these books of chivalry have done this to him. Not a Catholic one, or maybe a kind of offshoot of a Catholic one that shouldn't have official recognition or something like that. Do you have any thought about that?
You mean other than he's just wrong?
That's one possible reading, that the canon is wrong and Quixote is right, that this is a kind of Catholic thing to do, namely try to be a knight errant.
Well, if you, at one level, the canon is really saying it's filled with false stories. Not that it's filled with false values necessarily, that these stories are invented and any falsehoods are to be objected to, certainly in the pure world of the canon. But that doesn't undermine the notion that what chivalry is all about, in Quixote's mind, is the same thing what the church is all about, or should be.
That's really interesting. So on that reading, the canon takes books of chivalry to be dangerous, but not as dangerous as they would be if they were, say, un-Catholic about their values. If they had notions of virtue and vice, or say a cosmology, or I don't know what else that you could do to be blasphemous, a whole set of things. If they were atheistic in some way, or I don't know. They just get the facts wrong. They make people believe falsehoods. They don't imitate the truth very well, but they don't make such a break with the church as to try to invent new values or something like that.
Right.
So,
I mean, who was it? Was it Plato that talked about, you know, the legends of the gods and how dangerous they were?
Mhm.
Because not because their values were wrong, but because they portrayed the gods in a way that undermined the values of society. Not that the gods didn't exist, not that the gods, you know, didn't have godlike powers, but that they were portrayed novelistically, if you will. They were portrayed falsely. And to me, it's the same sort of point of view.
I see. I mean, I'm stumbling a bit on this because Plato, the Socrates critique in the Republic is clearly that the values in those embedded in those stories are damaging and therefore wrong. I mean, so
But
if
they're
there is
false.
kind of,
But they're false. They're
right,
they're not the true stories of the gods. They're fables invented for children, or fables invented by government to make it possible to govern and, you know, placate the masses. But it's not that the gods don't exist in the way that they were originally portrayed. They've just been corrupted.
so here's the way I see the difference between your reading of what Plato's doing there, or Socrates is saying, and what the canon is saying. On your reading, the canon is saying books of chivalry contain falsehoods, but they're not morally damaging or bankrupt. Their values are more or less in line with the church's, or at least tacitly he's saying that. Whereas Socrates is saying these stories are, what Homer says about the gods is both false and deeply damaging. You know, it's way out of line with what the actually good values. And so you see Quixote in this later chapter that we're now discussing to be, I guess, in line with the canon, thinking that knight errantry, its values are properly Catholic, even if they disagree about whether the facts claimed by books of chivalry are true. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Steve, go ahead, and then Larry.
I guess I was going to go in the other direction in the history of philosophy. I'm trying to think of, so what would Nietzsche say? Okay. I think that what you have in Don Quixote is a master hero figure crusading on behalf of slave morality. And so there's nothing in the doctrine of what Quixote is trying to reinforce and save in terms of modesty, chastity, fill in those blanks, virtue. Those are totally consistent with Catholicism. Again, I'm talking from 90% ignorance in terms of detailed knowledge of Catholicism, but in terms of at a superficial level. But what he's doing is injecting another source of authority, as opposed to the church and the priests being the master figure. What is deeply threatening to the church potentially is another way of supporting and exemplifying, not on the pulpit, but actually this whole question we brought up earlier before, between words and deeds. And the question it begs is, which is really more powerful? Again, is Don Quixote in his fantasy world is going around trying to actually change things, as opposed to the priests, which are saying, espousing the same things, but saying, just listen to me and I will tell you what it is that you need to do. You don't need a hero traipsing through the countryside.
I think I'm losing my grip on the slave morality point now, and maybe that's related to this one. And I actually was going to ask you to explain this thought for people who haven't read the relevant works of Nietzsche. The genealogy of morals comes to mind, but maybe he uses that phrase, I'm sure, elsewhere. So the thought is, Steve, Quixote takes himself to be a good Catholic. This is one way of being an exemplary Catholic, namely to be a knight errant. You know, it's just as good as the priests. You're just accomplishing similar goals, all of which God would avow as holy ones by different means. But the church looks at Quixote, or say church hierarchy might look at Quixote as voiced by the canon, and think, this guy is claiming an authority for himself and his way of life that rivals ours, and we don't recognize it as his books, or maybe the figure of this guy, or maybe in the way of life as
It's a terrible pun, but it's a terrible pun, but he's a loose cannon.
Oh boy. So
Was bad.
can you explain the thought about slave morality? Is that essential to this point? Do you want to bring people along with you who haven't read?
Well, I mean, it's like I said, I knew I was walking on a type, but I mean, the whole notion of the virtues that talk about turning the other cheek, that are subservient. I mean, that's probably the clearest example of that are subservient, and Nietzsche goes as far as to say slave-like values, are arguably at the core of Jesus's teachings, and that changing from a heroic version of life where strength and might are right, or juxtaposing that versus the slave morality, which is turn the other cheek, there's a life after this one, that's really what the battle is all about. So Quixote is personifying that heroic nature, which is again, the church has basically said, that's reserved for me.
Right.
And so that's where the master slave thing comes in, which is the values are the values, in terms of actions versus words. But I think that's where I was kind of going, which you have this dichotomy where Quixote is trying to bridge that gap. And again, there's a little bit of question, so what would Nietzsche say? And I think that he would find a way to fit that into that dichotomy.
Got it. I'm gonna broaden this just slightly, because I think I get a thought now. The thought is, who did Jesus claim were the really good people? Well, it's the downtrodden and the poor and the suffering and the meek, not the rulers or the conquerors or the strong warriors or the healthy and so forth. And Quixote, although monk-like, he undergoes a kind of mortification of the flesh on horseback and sleeping in the rough and so forth. What he does is claim what you're calling a slave morality for himself, where, the holiness does involve humility and conquering those 6 deadly sins, at least 6. But he's also someone who vanquishes for Jesus, or for, in the name of protecting the suffering. And that bit is doesn't take into account the reversal of morality, where before, in Homer's day, it was Hector and the strong guys who were on top, and in Jesus's telling, Hector is he's on the bottom of the scale of morals, and Thyestes, or not Thyestes, sorry, Thersites, and people who are not doing so well in their bodies or their wealth or so forth are on the top. Quixote is claims slave morality insofar as he thinks the Catholic Church has got the hierarchy right. Those who suffer are the most holy. But on the other hand, he claims that kind of old heroic mentality where whoever vanquishes is the best. And that's a tension. And maybe that's a grounds, I take it you're saying, is this right, for someone like the canon to say, that guy is actually dangerous. He's got elements of the old morality that we drove out of the world at work in his way of life. Is that right?
That was much better said than I did. Yes, thank you.
Other thoughts about Quixote's relating of religion to knight errantry in chapter 8. Larry, you had your hand up before and then it went down.
The only thing that comes to mind was we touched on last week that the canon of Toledo suggests that that the fables of knight errantry be replaced with the fables of the Old Testament. In terms of orienting people in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he added to those, though, a bunch of histories in which there are, I think almost all of which featured Christian military heroes driving out infidels of one kind or another. So there is a kind of championing on even the canon's part of military heroism. It does seem like, I mean, you know, in my understanding of the history of the Catholic Church, there was a whole lot of church hierarchy making league with military forces and secular authorities of various kinds. So
one difference that strikes me between Don Quixote and the Catholic Church or the canon, Don Quixote has, I don't see that he has any economic self-interest in his adventures. And I don't think the same can be true about the Catholic Church.
yeah, I mean, it depends on which
There doesn't seem to be any materialism at all to Don Quixote. He's doing this entirely for idealistic reasons.
I mean, we haven't met a lot of friars, you know, or monks, people for whom mortification of their flesh and humility is part of their way of life. But I take it, you're right, that for the church hierarchy in some more global sense, you know,
right.
charges.
Yeah, I mean, even Sancho Panza has an economic self-interest in wanting an island, governmentship, a way of raising his family, you know, up from impoverished lifestyle. But in Don Quixote's case, I just haven't seen that in the novel so far.
Yeah, it seems fundamental to his character that he embraces suffering, and fundamental to Sancho's that he's interested in doing well by Sancho in various respects.
Yeah.
By the way, that passage I was referring to is on 452. These are not all Christian heroes. Some of them, he mentions Caesar, Hannibal, Alexander, and then a bunch of Christian heroes in these histories as well, if people want to have a look.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about this discussion of religion in chapter 8, part 2? Okay, let me raise question 5. So this is the question about the episode that Remus brought up earlier, in which rather than Sancho and Carrasco or the priest, the barber, Dorotea, and so forth, Sancho exploits Quixote's madness by trying to convince Quixote, get himself out of jail by convincing Quixote that the 3 peasant girls they meet in El Toboso or by El Toboso are in fact maids riding palfreys, which he calls poultries. I like that one a lot. And that one of them is Dulcinea. Quixote manages to resist at first, but then justifies, rationalizes his way into believing that Sancho must be right and that an enchanter must have transformed Dulcinea and her accompanying maids. What do you think? This is another instance in which somebody indulges Quixote's madness for their own purposes. Does it deserve any kind of new interpretation in line with the other instances in which this has happened? Anything we should think about this moment in particular? See,
to me, this was a decisive break when as I was reading it, and this was not. I mean, yeah, there are certainly other instances of other people trying to take advantage of him, but the notion that Sancho would come upon this struck me as being a really decisive break between book 2 and book 1. That this is a different Sancho. Even, I mean, there was the apocryphal note earlier, but that this is a different Sancho, and that in some senses, Don Quixote is now alone. He's got no one telling him this is all bullshit. You shouldn't believe this. This is, I mean, he's got no one coaxing him back, you know, from his own best interests. Everybody now, Sancho has now become one more person who's manipulating his delusions.
So in light of that, Steve, what do you make of Sancho's attempt to tell a false story, to sell Quixote on a false story in book 1, that he's returned from El Toboso with a letter from Dulcinea? Is that different in kind from what's going on in this episode?
I think that's very different in kind.
Tell me why.
I mean, that's one where I'll call that one, that falls into the white lie category for me. This is outright deception. This is gaslighting. This is don't believe your eyes. Okay.
Right.
You know, you're actually, I mean, this is one where Don Quixote is actually seeing things clearly.
I see.
And Sancho is telling him, no, you're not.
Okay, so the earlier lie, it leaves Quixote's beliefs as they were before it was told. Quixote goes on believing Dulcinea is out there somewhere. It's just there's a new fact about her. She's returning my letter. Whereas this is adding to the fiction, enriching the fiction somehow, making Quixote incorporate this new strange piece of evidence into the old worldview, namely that these 3 peasant girls are in fact maids and one of them is Dulcinea. I can see the distinction why you would call the one a white lie and the other something more complex.
Well, because Sancho is just like buying into, or actually reinforcing the story that there are indeed enchanters out there that are shaping the way you see the world. And I think he's never acknowledged that before. He said this enchanting thing is a bunch of hooey.
Larry and then Gary.
This was really, I think, the low point for Don Quixote. This scene with the 3 girls and the one who's supposed to be Dulcinea. He's really at a very, very low point. You know, with nobody to help him, with nobody, you know, to sort of lift him up, you know, from this encounter.
There's one other moment in the novel where he's more depressed, it seems, but this is pretty bad.
He's really brought to his knees, I think.
Gary, go ahead.
I think Steve is too hard on Pancho, on Sancho rather. I mean, he's about to be found out. I mean, on something absolutely critical to his relationship with Don Quixote, and he's got to come up with a story, and so he does. And I'm not so sure I see a big difference, but to me that's much less important. What struck me about this is that there's something fishy about this whole story. I mean, first of all, it's handled very, very tersely, I think. I expected this to be much more involved. I mean, Don Quixote is the center of his chivalric existence, his relationship, he thinks, with Dulcinea. And so this thing happens that ought to be absolutely critical to his entire world. And he buys Sancho's story, and then it's kind of over. And it's a fairly short chapter. We're clear. I think we're either this is really bad writing, which I don't believe, or we're being set up for something that is going to be happening in the next, I don't know, 100 pages or so, because it's too important for it to be just passed off as easily as it was.
Huh. I mean, there's a lot of like suspense built into this thought. I'm trying to think like, what could Cervantes' motive has been for having such a, I mean, this should be climactic. I take your point. Like Dulcinea is the North Star for Quixote through part one. You know, we've heard lots about her. We've never met her. Here she is kind of, and it's very dissatisfying. It's not high drama of any kind.
Well, it also just, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, he should be destroyed. He should be totally crushed. Much more so than all the beatings he's gotten, because this is what is the sort of central motivation, right? To prove to this great object of his love that he is worthy of her. And he's finally gotten to meet her. And within a couple of pages, it's over. Mm-hmm. And he believes he's been enchanted, and we go on. It doesn't ring true.
I mean, do you think that the resort to enchantment here is an explanation of why Dulcinea looks to him like a peasant girl, is a way of not putting the climax aside, but saying, well, it's further in the future. Now I just have to contend with the enchanter, whoever that is. It just extends the quest.
Well, it's the reason I disagree with Steve, because I think it's the obvious cover story. You know, it's the one that Don Quixote keeps using over and over and over again to explain his disconnection from reality in a way that is at least mostly consistent. So for Sancho to come up with it, it's what else is he going to come up with? So in that sense, it's a pretty easy plot device, and it's consistent with everything that's gone on up until this point. Mm-hmm. What isn't consistent is the effect it has on Don Quixote.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Karen, and then Cindy.
Well, first of all, like Gary just said about Dulcinea and how important she is, that's really interesting. And I don't have anything to add to it, but it's really interesting that it was such a nothing event. But back to Sancho, I also felt like I didn't see it as nefarious. Like I saw it as just like an easy lie for him to tell, you know, to get out of trouble, because he never really went to see Dulcinea. But the way he does it, it's almost like it's a little bit like a kid or a teenager who has already tried a few times and then realizes that isn't working, and they notice what works for the adults, so then they start spinning that into their stories. And in a way, it's like he's holding up a mirror to Don Quixote. He's kind of reflecting back what Don Quixote says. I don't think it's to make fun of him or anything like that. I mean, he's just it works. So he's just reflecting back what he says. And I wonder where that's gonna take us, because if he reflects it back enough, how will it change Don Quixote?
Interesting. I mean, that last note does have kind of sinister implications. Maybe this power that Sancho has learned to wield and does in a moment of emergency when he's about to be found out, it can get out of control. It can work powerfully on Quixote in a way that Sancho can't anticipate. That's a really interesting thought, Karen. I mean, to me, that teenagers do this, yeah, absolutely. But this is like a central principle of rhetoric, persuasion, gulling someone, gaining confidence. You say, hey, you and me, we're cut from the same cloth. Let me tell you how things are. There's something about learning how to speak the kind of language of your audience that makes the deception more effective. I think that's a really interesting reading of what's going on with Sancho, and it's a way of putting some meat on the bones of this thought that Sancho undergoes a serious change between parts 1 and part 2. He starts to manipulate Quixote, be able to speak his language, like puppet Quixote's way of construing the world. And continue it for his own purposes. My head is, yeah, kind of a lot of possibilities dancing through it now. Cindy, go ahead.
So I guess I want to come to Sancho's defense here a little, because he's been given this impossible task by a madman, right? In this city, he's decided that in this city is the beautiful Dulcinea who lives in a castle. And, you know, the first time Sancho was sent, he was supposed to take a letter, and it was relatively harmless. He came back and said, well, I took her the letter. Of course, she wasn't even there. And now, you know, if you look at how much time he spends thinking about this, he gets at 5:44, Don Quixote sends him out to find her. And then he's like, what am I supposed to do here? She's not here. There isn't a castle here. He's going to insist she's here. And he's really upset about it. And then he says, then he does a soliloquy, and then he talked to himself again. On the other hand, there's a remedy for all things. He looks at anything and turns it into something else. So I guess that's my solution. It isn't like he set this up to get extra money from the guy or to take advantage of him. He was like given an impossible task and working with what he had, which was the fact that Don Quixote could look at a flock of sheep and see an army. His solution is, I'll show up, I'll find the first girl I can and tell him that's Dulcinea, and eventually it works. And what makes it really even odder is that in the first paragraph, the translator says the author didn't even want to tell this story. And he says, because here Don Quixote's mad deeds approach the limits of the imaginable, and indeed went a couple of bow shots beyond them. So the author's kind of saying this is just another example of truly how mad Don Quixote is. So I'm not saying it's the best thing Sancho ever did, but he was kind of stuck.
Mm-hmm.
If he'd have come back and said to this guy, this is all nonsense. There is no Dulcinea. There is no castle. There is no nothing. Who knows what would have happened next, right? This guy goes running into the town with his lance and tries to find her. I don't know. I just think he really, and the amount of time he took to figure out what to do just at least tells me he's not doing this he's really dealing with the total insanity of this guy. And what do I do now? As opposed to he used it to get something from him. You know, he didn't ask for like 10 gold escudos or another 100 gold escudos or something. It was just kind of like, now what do I do now?
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't his best day, but he was kind of also stuck in an insanity.
So, okay, Cindy, this is really clarifying for me because I'm stepping back and trying to describe the practical situation that Sancho actually is in and that he takes himself to be in. But I have some questions about how you read this. Do you think Sancho thinks there is no Dulcinea? Or does he think, well, maybe there is a Dulcinea here somewhere, but I'm never going to find her. And I already claimed that I had found her. So Quixote has every expectation based on the lie that I've told, that I know where she is, and I can't follow through with that lie. I can't make good on my promise. So I've got to create another lie at this point to cover my first lie.
I don't even think he's worried about his first lie. If you look at the bottom of 544, he says to himself, so tell me, Sancho, what is it you're gonna do? You're not just looking for some donkey you've lost. No, I'm going to look for some princess. That's all the Son of Beauty in the whole of heaven in one person. And where are you going to find her? Where? In the great city of El Tabasco. And whose behalf? On behalf of this. So this is how he views it. And do you know where she lives? Well, he says she lives in a royal palace. And we've never seen this woman. And even if she was, I'm running into El Tabasco and spiriting away their princesses. So that's how he views it. It's almost as if the whole letter stuff and everything didn't matter as much as now I'm in El Tabasco. Where's the castle? Where's the beautiful princess that I'm supposed to come up with? I think that's what he sees. Let's see. Looking for Dulcinea in El Tabasco would be like looking for a student in Salamanca or a girl called Maria. And yes, it was the devil and nobody else that got me into this mess. So he's just really stuck about what he's supposed to do.
Right, but so my question is, how, it seems to me the fact of the matter, the way that we as readers understand Sancho's position at this point is that there is no Dulcinea. He's on a quixotic quest, if you will. So, you know, if he doesn't tell a lie, he's never going to find Dulcinea.
Right.
If he's determined to find her, yeah, the only way he's going to do it is to tell the kind of lie that he tells. But my question is, what does Sancho think? Does he think that? Or does it, in other words, there is no Dulcinea, and so the solution has to be that I pretend that whoever comes along is Dulcinea? Or
Well,
does he think, I'm never going to find Dulcinea, and it's dangerous to go snooping around here, even though she probably exists, so I better resort to this.
but he's not
lie.
just, it's not just go find the girl named Dulcinea, okay? It is go find the beautiful princess in the castle. If he were to find a Dulcinea, even the one, I think early in this book, somebody said, though it's changed a few times, that actually Don Quixote had seen somebody for a couple hours named Dulcinea. But that isn't going to satisfy him. He wants the Princess Dulcinea, who's beautiful. And he knows that doesn't exist. He said, I looked down there's no castles, right? There isn't a castle. So don't they meet somebody right before they come here and talk about the castle? The guy goes, I don't think there's any castles in that town. So this ideal, this dream that Don Quixote has, that woman doesn't exist, even if there's a woman around named Dulcinea.
Okay, so you think
That's how I see his, and that's, I think, what he's seeing. Because he isn't focusing on, I got to go find Dulcinea, whoever you, she's like, I got to go find a princess in a castle, blah, blah, blah. And none of that exists here. So what's the solution?
If he's on a quest to find the person in Quixote's imagination that Quixote might have made up, well, you might as well point to any peasant who walks along and say, go ahead, imagine her as the one from your imagination.
I
Okay,
think so. I think that's where he is.
Okay, I saw hands from Steve, then Marge, then April, and then Remus.
Yeah, I was reacting to Gary et al. In terms of perspective. I think you're right that I may have overstated the case. I mean, I don't think that Sancho is being malevolent here. Okay, it's not as if on the one side his goal isn't pure. His goal is to like get himself off the hook. But I don't think he's turned into some sort of malevolent presence, even temporarily. He has, I mean, to what Cindy said, he's taken the easy answer and maybe the only answer, given the dilemma that's been given him. But what I think, and it is maybe part and part of what Gary was alerting to in terms of, you know, in terms of number of pages, this doesn't have the kind of weight, this kind of thunderclap that you would expect it to be in terms of the, you know, his seeing or not seeing the Dulcinea of his dreams. But I do think it sets, you know, unintended consequences, a little bit like the teenager who tells the lie and it got him off the hook that time, but now puts me in a position where, oh my God, how do I dig myself out of this one? And what other problems have I caused?
Okay, Marge, and then April, then Remus, and then Cindy again.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the side of, he started down this path and now he didn't really know how to get out of it. And it causes him to do some soul searching, which was, I thought, kind of interesting. We hadn't seen much of that before, and some self-awareness of, you know, I'm even stupider than he is, following him and serving him as I do, if there's any truth in the proverb that says a man known by the company he keeps. And he sort of talks himself into, well, it'll be okay if I convince Don Quixote that these maids or whoever are peasant girls are princesses. So he kind of talks himself into it, but I get the feeling he feels really bad about the whole thing.
Mhm. So these are more features of Sancho 2.0. He's
Yeah,
reflective,
exactly.
He engages in soliloquies. He thinks of himself as stupid because he's following a madman around. April, go ahead, and then Remus.
Well, one thing that struck me about neither of the men seeing Dulcinea, I was trying to jog my memory from the first part. So on page 540, Don Quixote says, "I've never seen the peerless Dulcinea." But then right at the beginning at 29, page 29, it says, of that page, he didn't find someone to call his lady. And there was a woman in a nearby village, a good-looking peasant girl with whom he'd once been in love. So it seems like he had seen her. And then there's an exchange, I don't know what chapter, but between Sancho and Don Quixote, there's an exchange where he's like, "Oh, that's Aldolozo Lorenzo." And he's like, "No, call her this," but they both know what she looks like. And then suddenly, whoops, in part 2, they have no idea what she looks like. I just thought that was an interesting, yet another inconsistency with the previous part.
Yeah, what do you make of it? Should we just think of this as like the other inconsistencies, maybe casual or made intentional by Cervantes because he wants to flout deliberately the rules of consistency that govern the creation of narrative fiction?
I'm kind of with Gary that I think we're being set up for something larger to come, because
Right.
it was sort of like an inconsistent blip, this big deal that was just kind of glossed over, that I think maybe something else afoot.
Well, the canon is loaded. We have 300 more pages. See if he can get it to fire. But then Remus, go ahead, and then Cindy, and then Charles.
Well, I was going to say pretty much what April said. I think the references on page 214 where Don Quixote and Sancho are talking, and Don Quixote says that this Dulcinea is someone that he has known for 12 years, although he has not seen her as many as 4 times, and that her father is Lorenzo Conquelo and her mother is Aldonza Nogales. And Sancho says, "Oh, so Lorenzo Conquelo's daughter is the Lady Dulcinea, also known as Aldonza Lorenzo, is she?" So right there, it seems like he knows of the Sancho knows of the family, although he may not have ever met them. It still doesn't solve the problem. I mean, if he actually found the family and Aldonza Lorenzo, how is he going to convince her to play the role of Dulcinea and meet Don Quixote? And the problem still stands, but it's as if Don Quixote and Sancho have forgotten this conversation that they had way back on page 214.
I mean, this one, I actually have to say, I think is easier to explain, even if it still requires some finessing, to explain why there's actually consistency here, despite the apparent inconsistency, than the other kinds of, or the other points of inconsistency that we've been talking about, like the change of name from Juana to Teresa in between parts 1 and 2. I mean, here we know that love, Quixote was in love. It said on page 29, the narrator told us, as April in the passage April quoted, that Quixote was in love with a peasant girl in another town that he named Dulcinea. And we know that love does strange things to people. They are, you know, and Quixote in particular has a theory about how what you should do when you're in love is invent someone to be in love with and ascribe characteristics to her that you may not really have because you're stepping into the role of a lover and so forth. So there's a lot of like fantasy that lovers get to claim as a kind of artistic license. And likewise, Quixote and Sancho, they're not such reliable keepers of the facts of the story that they're in. So if they claim at one moment, you know, Quixote says, I've seen her 4 times, I've been in love with her for 12 years, why should we rely on his authority? And likewise, Sancho says, oh, so it's Aldonza Lorenzo, I know who she is. I mean, Sancho, he's a little bit soft-headed, so maybe that's not so reliable. But given all that, you know, the fact that Cervantes does not mark this out for us, that you have to go up, pick the breadcrumbs up from previous chapters in order to figure out what's going on here, I think tells in favor of the direction that you're pointing us, April and Rimas, that there's a kind of unaccounted for untidiness in the larger narrative that seems reminiscent of these other points of unaccounted for untidiness, the mystery of the 100 escudos, or the ass that pops up out of nowhere, or the change of Teresa and Juana's name. I find this all, yeah, confusing and maybe meaningful, who knows. It's good to have some text to examine it through though. Cindy, go ahead, and then Charles.
So I don't have any explanation about these different stories about her, but I just want to say that we seem to be saying that somehow Sancho set this up in some way because he claimed he went there before, but the whole fantasy starts with Don Quixote. It's not like Sancho says, hey, there's this great princess who lives in El Toboso and maybe she should be your lady. The story's already there, and the first time when he makes up taking her the letter, he's just pacifying the guy. And then at this time, he can't. He even says a couple of times before he goes, you know, when I saw her, she was, I don't know, doing something with wheat, and she was behind a wall, and Don Quixote's having nothing of it. No, it was a portico, it was a castle, it was a this. As a matter of fact, his version of Dulcinea is getting bigger and bigger. She's now a princess in a castle as opposed to a lady. So he's really, all I'm saying is I think that Sancho did the best he could the first time, thought maybe he could get away with it, but he didn't set this up. Don Quixote set this up, and now Sancho's kind of stuck. And in a sense, what he comes up with is, you know, kinder than just saying, well, look, you're crazy. There is no castle. There is no princess. And so, and again, I don't see that he does it for a malevolent or a personal reason. It's not a personal gain reason that I could see.
This reminds me a lot of Karin's reading of a comparison of Sancho to a teenager. You know, the teenager doesn't invent the conventions that they exploit in a moment of panic to try to convince the adults that they need to get on their side, that they're, you know, telling the truth about something. Likewise, Sancho didn't invent the story that he now needs to produce the goods to confirm. He's just scrambling to confirm it. Yeah, it's an interesting observation, Cindy. Charles, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wanted to say that I think it's that Cervantes has forgotten what he wrote before. It was 10 years previously. He probably didn't go back and check everything. And I think it's as simple as an author not going back, you know, to something that he wrote 10 years previously, and he just forgot.
Totally possible. I got to tell you, Charles, there are whole industries of people who spend their lives. I have spent a lot of time with them trying to figure out how to square one thing in Aristotle's vast corpus with a thing that he says somewhere distant from it in theme and time, potentially. And the working conceit is it's all systematic. These things all connect. They have to, because there's a vast puzzle for us to figure out. But the explanation that you're offering is always a possibility. He just forgot. Homer nodded, as I forget who said that. There are just mistakes in these great works, and sometimes the story isn't kept straight by the author.
I used to, in my earlier life, I worked at a newspaper for a while, and it's amazing the mistakes that are made in the middle of the night.
Mhm.
In the writing process.
Yeah, for whatever reason, maybe this is where we pay Cervantes and Aristotle too much respect if we think they're not like us in this respect, that they don't make mistakes. But yeah, fair enough. Any other thoughts about Sancho's exploitation of Quixote's madness in this moment before I move us on to the next question? Okay. All right, this is another episode in question 6 on a related theme, insofar as, like so many other episodes in the novel, Quixote has to grapple with the difference between appearance and reality. Sometimes he does this by resorting to enchanters. In this case, as with the Fullinghammers, he just says the appearances were deceptive. What does he say? On my faith as a knight errant, when I saw this cart full of these actors dressed up in these fantastical costumes, I imagined that it heralded some great adventure, and now I do declare that appearances must be examined closely to discover the hidden truth. Really laying it on thick. This guy whose madness is characterized by his being unable to examine appearances in the way that other people do and draw conclusions about them that seem to be justified by the act of reflecting on them critically. The rest of the episode, I think, is relevant to how we understand that remark, namely Quixote recognizing these actors for actors rather than for demons and so forth, offers them his services, but a clown, probably not accidental that it's a clown, makes some mischief, knocks Quixote off his horse effectively, rides off with Sancho's ass. Quixote decides to take revenge. Sancho tries to dissuade him by saying, everybody likes actors, they amuse people, so people look out for them. You're not gonna get anywhere in attacking them. And Quixote ultimately decides not to attack them, but only because he sees they might be formidable in a fight. All parts of this seem to me interesting and interacting with one another, although I don't understand how they all add up. So I'm going to throw this over to all of you. What do you think? How should we interpret this episode? What's Cervantes doing here? Any thoughts? Yeah, Gary?
Well, I have no idea if this is right, but I like the idea that Cervantes is having his character give a break to people who are in the arts. So people that in fact, I don't know if Cervantes wrote plays. I think everybody wrote plays. So my guess is he did. So I don't know that it's any more than that, because you're right. It's startling that, common sense rears its ugly head.
I'm looking back at my notes on the introduction. He did write several plays that were staged in 1581. So I'm reading. Okay, so Cervantes throws a bone to artists, features them in his novel, has them treated well. They're figures who amuse all and are protected by all, except for Don Quixote momentarily. Charles, go ahead.
I may be wrong, but I think Remus had a comment on the previous thing that we didn't get to. Am I right? No? Okay. All right, then I have nothing further to say.
Okay. It was very, neighborly and. Any other thoughts about how we should interpret this episode? Quixote makes this remark about not taking appearances for what they seem to be. Very strange. A clown rides up. Clowns, I mean, these are kind of clown figures, Quixote and Sancho. Quixote doesn't appreciate their antic, the clown's antics, and just the way that a lot of people react to him. It seems like there's something that needs interpretation here, and I don't know how to take it, but yeah. Cindy, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think it makes sense because he's a person who lives in make-believe, and he gives a break to a bunch of people who live in make-believe. So it has almost a, I don't know, it just makes sense that of all the people he would like give a break to are people who on a daily basis act, what does he do? He really runs around all day playing at being a knight errant, and these people run around playing at being probably knight errants and all sorts of other things. So in a sense, there's a connection in a way between him and actors, because that's what he is, right? Only he's taken method acting to a whole new level, right? He actually believes it. But if he were just a few notches down, he'd be an actor. And so the fact that he would kind of see them, and they're like kindred spirits in a weird kind of way. So I think it made great sense that of the whole group that he would say, oh yeah, that's what they are, because he's more like them than anybody else he's seen.
So when you say he gives them a break, Cindy, I mean, he doesn't intentionally give them, or he doesn't intend to give them a break until he sees they might actually put up a fight if he attacks them. I'm not sure he has like a kindly attitude towards them ultimately. What do you think? Am I getting that wrong?
No, I guess what I'm saying is he recognizes, right? He recognizes that they're actors, doesn't he?
Yeah. Yes, he does.
That's like huge if you think about it. You know, right. It's like these people are actually dressed up as things. So he could really run with that, but he recognizes. So that's what I'm saying. He recognizes. Yeah, eventually he still wants to be the knight and wants to do them a good turn, right? So, but the clown, the clown creates a clown diversion. But I just think it would make sense that he would recognize them because there's a kindred spirit thing about them. They really are doing close to what he's doing, though they're not insane.
That makes sense to me. I mean, let me take another run up to this describing this episode in a way that might provoke some thoughts, right? So in part one, there really were not many instances in which Quixote's circumstances that would have been like really conducive to Quixote doing what he thinks he ought to be doing, serving as a knight errant. There have been at least 2 episodes. I mean, we've had 3 episodes thus far up to this point in the second part. One is the confrontation with the fake Dulcinea. Another is, I guess I should say 2. An encounter with people who were like exactly who Quixote would want to meet. There's a demon driving a cart. There's death with a human face. There's an angel, an emperor with a gold crown, Cupid with bow and arrows, a knight in full armor. Like maybe not exactly characters you might find in a work of knight errantry, but pretty close. And likewise, you might say about the encounter with Sansón Carrasco that we've talked about, but haven't. It's further on in the novel from this, and also with the lions. Quixote, on the face of it, is getting exactly what he always wanted to run into in part 1, and yet he, rather than doing what he would habitually do in part 1, think here must be a bunch of phantoms rather than clerics transporting a body. or, this is two opposing armies rather than sheep, or these are giants rather than a wineskin or windmills. He sees that they're actors. He sees through appearances and makes this kind of wise, unintentionally wise comment about how you should always examine appearances. I mean, it seems like Cervantes is doing something with setting us up by putting Quixote in like what should seem to him to be the most appropriate situation he's been in which to be a knight errant, and yet it doesn't grab him. And that seems striking. I don't know what to make of it, but it does not seem casual along those lines. Any other thoughts about this episode? Well, if not, I think I can yoke the next a few questions into the same line of thought, so it's not waste of energy. Although before that, people who were in the course I taught in the fall on aesthetics will have recognized this passage that I'm asking about in question 7, in which Sancho tells this story about his ancestors who can discriminate very finely the flavor notes in wine, and Sancho claims the same ability. What do you make of this? What's going on with this story? I mean, I know what Hume does with it. It's very interesting. You put that to one side. Is this meaningful that Sancho is like not just a gourmand, as we've seen he is, somebody who loves just eating to excess, but a gourmet, at least when it comes to wine, someone who can distinguish the fine flavor notes in wine, and that he's got a kind of pedigree, ancestors who were able to do this. This is another thing that seems meaningful, but I don't know what it means. Yeah, Gary?
I think maybe one of the problems I had with it was just the sort of difference in being a 21st century person versus a 16th century person. But wine is so connected to, rural farming. It's the sort of thing that I think that kind of skill, I mean, this doesn't explain why it's here, but as I kept trying to think about it, I mean, it's not the kind of skill that at the time I think anyone would think was some incredibly sophisticated skill or virtue. It was the sort of thing that the people who were close to the earth acquired. That doesn't really answer the question though about why it's just sort of stuck in here, and I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, that's interesting. I had never considered that. By the way, I didn't include this in the question I see, but this is chapter 13 on 569, maybe. Yeah, I believe that's right. 568 to 569. So this evinces not Sancho's bona fides as a gourmet, but as a kind of peasant well connected to the earth. He can distinguish the terroir of various wines, and that's not a fancy thing to be able to do, but an old country boy's ability. It's an interesting thought. Okay, well, if there are no other thoughts about this passage, I guess I'll leave it aside and think about it along with Hume. So we're up to this defense of poetry, question 8, that Quixote gives to Don Diego de Miranda in order to express to Don Diego de Miranda that his son is actually doing something noble and worthwhile in studying poetry at the university, even though Don Diego does not think so. In the way that I framed this question, have tipped my hand as to what I think is interesting about it, namely that in previous discussions about the dangers of literature or the dangers involving literature, the kind of danger we've heard about has always been the corruption of the readers. And here we get the opposite. Quixote says not that readers have to be protected from poetry, but that poetry has to be protected from the wrong kinds of readers, and maybe also from the wrong kinds of writers who would use poetry for put it in bad kinds of genres, write lewd satires or baneful sonnets. Those are out of bounds. So what do you think? Can we put this defense of poetry and of its study in line with, can we understand it alongside the previous discussions of literature? Is it interesting in its own right for any particular reason? Does it relate to our discussion of Sansón Carrasco's distinction between poetry and history, which now I'm seeing Larry made that connection earlier, and he has fled the scene before I could ask him about it, now that we're getting to the passage that he said was definitely connected to this earlier one. So that was sneaky. But any thoughts about this? Any thoughts about this passage? Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, I was struck by the passage as I read it. It's one of those things where, two things can be contradictory and both can still be true. Where the notion of, the censorship would, in terms of certain people shouldn't be able to read certain sorts of literature, that has a directional arrow, which we kind of accept as it is. But the notion that there's another kind of censorship, kind of keeping poetry pure, keeping it so that, you could walk down and think, at what point does mass popularization destroy the work of art that's being displayed? When it gets excerpted, and you can think about, you kind of roll the thing forward. You think about, poems that are known by a line that when you actually read the poem, you realize that's not what the poem is about at all. And I think, reading poetry in basic program year 4 right now, and you see that in a lot of, the Shakespeare, how shall I compare these to A Summer's Day? Again, the poet, the expectation that's teed up in the first line, which everybody knows, has very little to do with how the poem itself rolls out. And I think, again, this is a case of it's a reversal, but I think it's as much of what you see depends on where you sit. Is that they're, again, from the point of view of a priest, there might well be good reasons for you to say that shouldn't see the light of day. I need to protect it, what you're saying from readers. From a perspective of aesthetic purity, the notion that poems or literature can be corrupted by mass distribution is a very prescient thought. I wonder even to what degree it's a realistic concern in the context of, again, 16th century Spain, where arguably the best example of that might be Don Quixote Volume 1.
So that's interesting. Now that you're saying that, it's making me think, the priest did express a similar concern. He said, and the priest and the canon, variations of this, the priest said, people write these terrible plays and they blame the public for it. But, it's not really the public's fault. This is the fault of impresarios and actors who think the public demands really bad material that's amusing. But the canon says ultimately the danger of that kind of thing is not the corruption of the art form by itself, but the corruption of the people by way of corrupt plays and literature. So Steve, what you're saying is a variation on that, where it's the same dynamic that's being identified, where the popular taste corrupts the handling of poetry, in this case, a form of literature, but why the explanation of why that's bad doesn't end with the audience, the corruption of the audience, but with the corruption of the poetry. What we're defending is the poetry, and your thought is that it's actually really true we do misremember.
Think about, here's an example for you. Think about all the people, and I'll include myself before reading this book, who only know Man of La Mancha from the musical, which has to be one of the worst musicals of all time with 2 great songs.
Uh-huh.
And your vision of Don Quixote and Dulcinea and Sancho Panza is driven by this 2-hour terrible distillation, again, which is redeemed by a couple of good songs and a couple of great performances in the original version. Does that have a corrupting effect on whether people even want to bother to read the actual novel? I mean, maybe it doesn't, but does it corrupt the understanding or the aesthetic value of the source from which it comes?
I'm sure that some of my undergrads watched Troy rather than read the Iliad. I mean, it's a real phenomenon for sure. Cindy, go ahead.
So what I think is, I think this is the voice of the author. And what I think is unique about this isn't an argument about poetry. This isn't even an argument about protecting poetry. This is poetic. It's full of metaphor. It's full of description. We start out with poetry is like a young, tender, lovely maiden. And then we have all the other maidens. And then she is made of an alchemy gold of such excellence that anyone who knows how to treat her will turn her into pure gold of innocence. It's all image. It's all metaphor. It's all poetry. It is poetry. It's maybe not in stanzas, but the nature of this argument, unlike most of the other ones we've seen about genre, what is truth, to me, is reflective of what it's talking about, and it makes its argument by using poetic images and how you treat this lovely maiden and the gold, and that's, I thought, what was unique about it. And it seemed to me that it's really beautiful, and it is something a writer would write. So I feel like it's almost Cervantes talking. But those are the things that I thought were great about it, not the argument, but the way the argument was made, in that it was made using the very nature of what poetry uses, images and metaphors, to make its argument. So that's
a fitting way to defend poetry. Do it poetically.
I'm sorry. Yeah. If you're going to defend poetry, do it with poetry. And
You should see the
that,
terrible.
but it wasn't in stanzas. I get that, but it pulls out all the various things that poets use in poetry.
You should see some of the terrible dry defenses of poetry that professional philosophers write. Occasionally they're really tough going. Karin, go ahead.
I just find it interesting that there's a line buried in the middle. It says, on no account must she be sold, except in heroic poems, mournful tragedies, and cheerful, well-contrived comedies. So it's kind of like saying, well, my story, I mean, I sort of feel like Don Quixote saying, well, my story, yeah, I mean, it should be told and it should be sold. But pure and beautiful poetry should be treated like the princess in the castle. He ascribes sort of an idyllic view to it, the same way that he does to the knight errant's fair lady. It was just interesting. It looks like his story should still be told.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't fit this qualification.
Because it's a heroic poem. Is that the reading?
Yeah, because it's a heroic poem or a well-contrived comedy. We haven't even decided exactly what it is yet, but it's a story that sort of fits into the genre of what should be shared.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, so there's a question. Does Quixote conceive of his own story as a comedy? I'm not sure.
Probably not. You're right.
Well, I mean, he might. I don't know. Having heard, I don't know. Honestly, that strikes me as not an open and shut case. But he definitely conceives it as a heroic poem, which is why I thought that's that's an easy one. The other two, I'm not sure. I mean, he's pretty down about Dulcinea, mournful tragedy. I don't know. Anyway, we have 5 minutes. Let me raise this last question. So the encounter with the lions. This is another case in which Quixote, although this is, kind of foolish and there's no good reason to do what he does, but he exhibits real courage in the face of a real danger. In this case, it's not even a kind of fake danger, as with the fulling hammer, which he resolutely approaches, even though he conceives of it as some menacing presence. I mean, these are big cats that will tear him apart if they actually decided to. And we get these two theories of courage in this chapter that it seems to me are interesting, one from the Carter and one from Don Quixote. I'm not going to spell them out in the interest of saving time and giving us a chance to discuss this. What do you think about either the episode in general or these two theories of courage, one from the Carter, one from Quixote? Any thoughts? Steve?
I'm really glad, and this is one of those things, to me, this is the counterpoint to the low point with the three maidens in the village, which, for different reasons, we can pull our hair out in terms of that scene and what it means, where the kind of the nadir of where Don Quixote's delusions can take him. And this one goes to the grandeur. This is one where, he, again, the motivation is always he kind of want to take your head, but he's showing genuine courage. And, the notion of it, of what courage is between the two extremes. I mean, Aristotle would be proud in terms of the way he defines courage there. And I just have, again, in terms of 100-page segments, this 100-page segment had the right story arc, okay? Got a little rough in the middle, had a nice kind of curve to the end, and just, again, a very, I don't know whether this peak gets surpassed in terms of him demonstrating exactly the virtues that he talks about in a way that undeniably brings credit to him.
Would Aristotle be proud? I mean, Aristotle's definition of courage entails feeling the right passions related to courage in the right circumstances at the right time with respect to the right object. I don't know if this is the right time or the right object to...
Maybe not, but the finding the golden mean in terms of what does it mean between cowardice and between false bravado. Yes, a lot from the outside it looks like false bravado.
Right.
From the worldview of Don Quixote, this is genuine courage under fire.
Mm-hmm. It very closely resembles courage in any case, and that is, I think, nearly unique to this episode relative to a bunch of others that we've seen. Gary, go ahead.
This is one Steve and I agree on completely. There's a kind of purity about this that kind of reawakened my fondness for Don Quixote. And Aristotle would be proud, by the way. I just think the fact that 2,000 years later or whatever it is, someone is using his golden means would have made him proud. By the way, I also have to say I do disagree with Steve about the original soundtrack for Man from La Mancha. It sucked. It was terrible. Even the best of songs on it, because I listened to it a couple of weeks ago. Even the best of songs on it are sung as though it's an opera, and they're terrible. Oh, sorry, Steve.
Speaking of narrative arcs, I'm hitting highs and lows. Has anybody seen the ballet? There's going to be a ballet performed by the Joffrey of Don Quixote. Is this any better than the musical? I don't know. Maybe some people have to go in June and report back. Well, it's 9:15. Unless there are any final thoughts about this episode with the lions, well, I guess we can call it a night. Okay. See you all next time for more Don Quixote. Take care. I'll see you all in a week.